Section 21 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Elbert Hubbard. William Wordsworth, Part 2. At places of pleasure and entertainment in the far West are often found functionaries known as bouncers. It is the duty of the bouncer to give hints to objectionable visitors that their presence is not desired. And inasmuch as there are many men who can never take a hint without a kick, the bouncer is a person selected on account of his peculiar fitness, psychic and otherwise, for the place. We all have special talents, and these faculties should be used in a manner that will help our fellow men on their way. My acquaintanceship with the bouncer has been only general, not particular, yet I have admired him from a distance, and the skill and éclat that he sometimes shows in a professional way has often excited my admiration. In social usages, America borrows constantly from the mother country, but like all borrowing, it seems to be one-sided. For seldom, very, very seldom, in point of etiquette and manners, does England borrow from us. Yet there are exceptions. It is a beautiful highway that skirts Lake Windermere and follows up through Ambleside. We get a glimpse of the old home of Harriet Martineau and Fox Howe, the home of Matthew Arnold. Just before Rydal Water is reached comes Rydal Road, running straight up the hillside off from the turnpike. Rydal Mount is the third house up on the left-hand side. I knew the location, for I had read of it many times, and in my pocket-book I carried a picture taken from an old Frank Leslie's, showing the house. My heart beat fast as I climbed the hill. To visit the old home of one who was Poet Laureate of England is no small event in the life of a book-lover. I was full of poetry, and murmured lines from the Excursion as I walked. Soon rare old Rydal Mount came in sight among the wealth of green. I stopped and sighed. Yes, yes, Wordsworth lived here for 33 years, and here he died. The spot whereon I there stood had been pressed many times by his feet. I walked slowly, with uncovered head, and approached the gate. It was locked. I fumbled at the latch, and just as there came a prospect of its opening, a loud, deep, guttural voice dashed over me like a wave. "There, you! Now, what do you want?" The owner of this voice was not 10 feet away, but he was standing up close to the wall, and I had not seen him. I was somewhat startled at first. The man did not move. I stepped to one side to get a better view of my interlocutor, and saw him to be a large red man of perhaps 50. A handkerchief was knotted around his thick neck, and he held a heavy hoe in his hand. A genuine beef-eater he was, only he ate too much beef, and the ale he drank was evidently extra XXX. His scowl was so needlessly severe, and his manner so belligerent, that I, thrice armed, knowing my cause was just, could not restrain a smile. I touched my hat, and said, "Ah, excuse me, Mr. Falstaff, you are the bouncer?" "Never mind what I am, sir. Who are you?" "I am a great admirer of Wordsworth." "That's the way they all begins. Can't you admire him on that side of the wall as well as this?" There is no use of wasting argument with a man of this stamp. Besides that, his question was to the point. But there are several ways of overcoming one's adversary. I began feeling in my pocket for a pence. My enemy ceased glaring, stepped up to the locked gate as though he half wished to be friendly, and there was sorrow in his voice. "Don't tempt me, sir, don't do it. The missus is peeking out of the shutters at us now." "And do you never admit visitors, even to the grounds?" "No, sir, never, God help me, and there's many an honest bob I could turn by it, and no one hurt. But I've lost my place twiced by it. They took me back, though, and governor 'd never forgive me again. It's 3 times and out, Mr. 'Opkins,' says he, 'only last Whitsuntide. But visitors do come." "Yes, sir, but they never gets in. Mostly 'Mericans. They don't know no better, sir. They picks all the ivy off the outside of the wall, and you sees yourself there's no leaves on the lower branches of that tree. Then they carries away so many pebbles from out there that I've to dump in a fresh wheelbarrowful of gravel every week, sir, don't you know." He thrust a pudgy, freckled hand through the bars of the gate, to show that he bore me no ill will, and also, I suppose, to mollify my disappointment. For although I had come too late to see the great poet himself, and had even failed to see the inside of his house, yet I had at least been greeted at the gate by his proxy. I pressed the hand firmly, pocketed a handful of gravel as a memento, then turned and went my way. And all there is to tell about my visit to Rydal Mount is this interview with the bouncer. Wordsworth lived 80 years. His habitation, except for short periods, was never more than a few miles from his birthplace. His education was not extensive, his learning not profound. He lacked humour and passion. In his character there was little personal magnetism, and in his work there is small dramatic power. He travelled more or less, and knew humanity, but he did not know man. His experience in so-called practical things was slight, his judgment not accurate. So he lived, quietly, modestly, dreamily. His dust rests in a country churchyard, the grave marked by a simple slab. A gnarled old yew-tree stands guard above the grass-grown mound. The nearest railroad is 15 miles away. As a poet, Wordsworth stands in the front rank of the second class. Shelley, Browning, Mrs. Browning, Tennyson far surpass him, and the sweet singer of Michigan, even in uninspired moments, never threw off anything worse than this. And he is lean, and he is sick, his body dwindled and awry, rests upon ankles swollen and thick, his legs are thin and dry. One prop he has, and only one, his wife, an aged woman, lives with him near the waterfall upon the village common. Jove may nod, but when he makes a move it counts. Yet the influence of Wordsworth upon the thought and feeling of the world has been very great. He himself said, "The young will read my poems and be better for their truth." Many of his lines pass as current coin. "The child is father of the man." "The light that never was on land nor sea." "Not too bright and good for human nature's daily food." "Thoughts that do lie too deep for tears." "The mighty stream of tendency," and many others. Plain living and high thinking is generally given to Emerson, but he discovered it in Wordsworth, and recognizing it as his own, he took it. In a certain book of quotations, the still sad music of humanity is given to Shakespeare, but to equalize matters we sometimes attribute to Wordsworth the old oaken bucket. The men who win are those who correct an abuse. Wordsworth's work was a protest, mild yet firm, against the bombastic and artificial school of the 18th century. Before his day the timber used by poets consisted of angels, devils, ghosts, gods. Onslaught, tourneys, jousts, tempests of hate, and torrents of wrath, always of course with a very beautiful and very susceptible young lady just around the corner. The women in those days were always young and ever beautiful, but seldom wise and not often good. The men were saints or else bad, generally bad. Like the cats of Kilkenny, they fought on slight cause. Our young man at Hawkshead School saw this. It pleased him not, and he made a list of the things on which he would write poems. This list includes sunset, moonrise, starlight, mist, brooks, shells, stones, butterflies, moths, swallows, linnets, thrushes, wagoners, babies, bark of trees, leaves, nests, fishes, rushes, leeches, cobwebs, clouds, deer, music, shade, swans, crags, and snow. He kept his vow and went it one better, for among his verses I find the following titles: Lines left upon a seat in a yew tree, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. To a wounded butterfly. To Dora's portrait. To the cuckoo. On seeing a needle-book made in the shape of a harp, etc. Wordsworth's service to humanity consists in the fact that he has shown us old truth in a new light, and has made plain the close relationship that exists between physical nature and the soul of man. Is this much or little? I think it is much. When we realize that we are a part of all that we see, or hear, or feel, we are not lonely, but to feel a sense of separation is to feel the chill of death. Wordsworth taught that the earth is the universal mother, and that the life of the flower has its source in the same universal life from whence ours is derived. To know this truth is to feel a tenderness, a kindliness, a spirit of fraternalism toward every manifestation of this universal life. No attempt was made to say the last word, only to express the truth that the Spirit of God is manifest on every hand. Now this is a very simple philosophy. No far-reaching, syllogistic logic is required to prove it. No miracle, no special dispensation is needed. You just feel that it is so. That's all, and it gives you peace. Children, foolish folks, old men, whose sands of life are nearly run, comprehend it. But heaven bless you, you can't prove any such foolishness. Geoffrey saw the ridiculousness of these assumptions, and so he declared, "This will never do," and for 20 years the Edinburgh Review never ceased to fling off fleers and jeers, and to criticise and scoff. That a great periodical, rich and influential, in the city which was the very centre of learning, should go so much out of its way to attack a quiet countryman living in a 4-roomed cottage, away off in the hills of Cumberland, seems a little queer. Then this countryman did not seek to found a kingdom, nor to revolutionize society, nor did he force upon the world his patty-pan rhymes about linnets and larks and daffodils. Far from it, he was very modest, diffident in fact, and his song was quite in the minor key, but still the chain-shot and bombs of literary warfare were sent hissing in his direction. There is a little story about a certain general who figured as division commander in the War of Secession. This warrior had his headquarters for a time in a typical Southern home in the Tennessee mountains. The house had a large fireplace and chimney. In this chimney swallows had nests. One day, as the great man was busy at his maps, working out a plan of campaign against the enemy, the swallows made quite an uproar. Perhaps some of the eggs were hatching. Anyway, the birds were needlessly noisy in their domestic affairs, and it disturbed the great man. He grew nervous. He called his adjutant. "Sir," said the mighty warrior, "dislodge those damn pests in the chimney without delay." 2 soldiers were ordered to climb the roof and dislodge the enemy. Yet the swallows were not dislodged, for the soldiers could not reach them. So Geoffrey's tirades were unavailing, and Wordsworth was not dislodged. "He might as well try to crush Skiddaw," said Southey. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Elbert Hubbard. William M. Thackeray. To Mr. Brookfield, September 16, 1849. Have you read Dickens? Oh, it is charming, brave Dickens. David Copperfield has some of his prettiest touches, and the reading of the book has done another author a great deal of good. W.M.T. There are certain good old ladies in every community who wear perennial mourning. They attend every funeral, carrying black bordered handkerchiefs, and weep gently at the right time. I have made it a point to hunt out these ancient dames at their homes and over the teacups. I have discovered that invariably they enjoy a sweet peace, a happiness with contentment that is a great gain. They seem to be civilization's rudimentary relic of the Irish keeners and the paid mourners of the Orient. And there is just a little of this tendency to mourn with those who mourn in all mankind. It is not difficult to bear another's woe, and then there is always a grain of mitigation even in the sorrow of the afflicted that makes their tribulation bearable. Burke affirms in On the Sublime that all men take a certain satisfaction in the disasters of others. Just as Frenchmen lift their hats when a funeral passes and thank God that they are not in the hearse, so do we in the presence of calamity thank heaven that it is not ours. Perhaps this is why I get a strange delight from walking through a graveyard by night. All about are the white monuments that glisten in the ghostly starlight. The night wind sighs softly among the grassy mounds. All else is silent, still. This is the city of the dead, and of all the hundreds or thousands who have traveled to this spot over long and weary miles, I, only I, have the power to leave at will. Their ears are stopped, their eyes are closed, their hands are folded, but I am alive. One of the first places I visited on reaching London was Kensal Green Cemetery. I quickly made the acquaintance of the first gravedigger, a rare wit, over whose grey head have passed full 70 pleasant summers. I presented him a copy of The Shroud, the organ of the American Undertakers' Association, published at Syracuse, New York. I subscribe for The Shroud because it has a bright wit and humor column, and also for the sweet satisfaction of knowing that there is still virtue left in Syracuse. The first gravedigger greeted me courteously, and when I explained briefly my posthumous predilections, we grasped hands across an open grave that he had just digged, and were fast friends. "Do you believe in cremation, sir?" he asked. "No, never. It's pagan." "Aye, you are a gentleman. And about burying folks in churches?" "Never. A grave should be out under the open sky, where the sun by day and the moon and stars—" "Right you are. How Shakespeare can ever stand it to have his grave walked over by a boy choir is more than I can understand. If I had him here I could look after him right. Come, I'll show you the company I keep." Not 20 feet from where we stood was a fine but plain granite block to the memory of the second wife of James Russell Lowell. Just Mr. Lowell and one friend stood by the grave when we lowered the coffin. Just 2 men, and no one else but the young clergyman who belongs here. Mr. Lowell shook hands with me when he went away. He gave me a guinea and wrote me 2 letters afterward from America. The last was sent only a week before he died. I'll show him to you when we go to the office. Say, did you know him?" He pointed to a slab on which I read the name of Sidney Smith. Then we went to the graves of Mulready the painter, Kemble the actor, Sir Charles Eastlake the artist. Next came the resting place of Buckle, immortal for writing a preface, dead at 37 with his history unwrit. Leigh Hunt sleeps near, and above his dust a column that explains how it was erected by friends. In life he asked for bread, when dead they gave him a costly pile of stone. Here also are the graves of Madame Tugennes, of Charles Matthews the actor, and of Admiral Sir John Ross the Arctic explorer. And just down the hill always another big man is buried. I knew him well. He used to come and visit us often. The last time I saw him I said, as he was going away, "Come again, sir. You are always welcome." "Thank you, Mr. First Gravedigger," says he. "I will come again before long and make you an extended visit." In less than a year the hearse brought him. That's his grave. Push that ivy away and you can read the inscription. Did you ever hear of him? It was a plain, heavy slab placed horizontally, and the ivy had so run over it that the white of the marble was nearly obscured. But I made out this inscription: "William Makepeace Thackeray, born July 18th, 1811, died December 24th, 1863. Anne Carmichael Smythe, died December 18th, 1864, aged 72, his mother by her first marriage. The unpoetic exactness of that pedigree gave me a slight chill, but here they sleep, mother and son, in one grave. She who gave him his first caress also gave him his last, and when he was found dead in his bed, his mother, who lived under the same roof, was the first one called. He was the child of her girlhood. She was scarcely 20 when she bore him. In life they were never separated, and in death they are not divided. It is as both desired. Thackeray was born in India, and was brought to England on the death of his father when he was 6 years of age. On the way from Calcutta, the ship touched at the island of St. Helena. A servant took the lad ashore, and they walked up the rocky heights to Longwood. And there, pacing back and forth in a garden, they saw a short, stout man. "Look'ee, lad, look'ee quick, that's him. He eats 3 sheep every day, and all the children he can get." "And that's all I had to do with the Battle of Waterloo," said old Thack 40 years after. But you will never believe it after reading those masterly touches concerning the battle in Vanity Fair. Young Thackeray was sent to the Charterhouse School, where he was considered rather a dull boy. He was big and good-natured, and read novels when he should have studied arithmetic. This tendency to play off stuck to him at Cambridge, where he did not remain long enough to get a degree, but to the relief of his tutors went off on a tour through Europe. Travel as a means of education is a very seductive bit of sophistry. Invalids whom the doctors cannot cure, and scholars whom teachers cannot teach, are often advised to take a change. Still, there is a reason in it. In England, Thackeray was intent on law. At Paris he received a strong bent toward art. But when he reached Weimar, and was introduced at the court of letters, and came into the living presence of Goethe, he caught the infection, and made a plan for translating Schiller. Schiller dead was considered in Germany a greater man than Goethe living, as if it were an offence to live and a virtue to die. And young William Makepeace wrote home to his mother that Schiller was the greatest man that ever lived, and that he was going to translate his books and give them to England. No doubt there are certain people born with a tendency to infectiousness in regard to certain diseases. So there are those who catch the literary mania on slight exposure. "I've got it," said Thackeray, and so he had. He went back to England and made groggy efforts at Blackstone and Somebody's Digest and What's-His-Name's Compendium, but all the time he scribbled and sketched. The young man had come into possession of a goodly fortune from his father's estate, enough to yield him an income of over $2,000 a year. But bad investments and signing security for friends took the money the way that money usually goes when held by a man who has not earned it. "Talk about riches having wings," said Thackeray. "My fortune had pinions like a condor, and flew like a carrier pigeon." When Thackeray was 30, he was eking out a meagre income writing poems, reviews, criticisms, and editorials. His wife was a confirmed invalid, a victim of mental darkness, and his sorrows and anxieties were many. He was known as a bright writer, yet London is full of clever, unsuccessful men. But in Thackeray's 38th year, Vanity Fair came out, and it was a success from the first. In Yesterdays with Authors, Mr. Field says, "I once made a pilgrimage with Thackeray to the various houses where his books had been written, and I remember when we came to Young Street, Kensington, he said with mock gravity, 'Down on your knees, you rogue, for here Vanity Fair was penned,' and I will go down with you, for I have a high opinion of that little production myself." Young Street is only a block from the Kensington Metropolitan Railway Station. It is a little street running off Kensington Road. At number 16, formerly number 13, I saw a card in the window, "Rooms to rent to single gentlemen." I rang the bell, and was shown a room that the landlady offered me for 12 shillings a week if I paid in advance, or if I would take another room 1 flight up with a gent who was studying Hart, it would be only 8 and 6. I suggested that we go up and see the gent. We did so, and I found the young man very courteous and polite. He told me that he had never heard Thackeray's name in connection with the house. The landlady protested that no man by the name o' Thackeray had had rooms here since I rented the place, leastwise, if he had been here, he called hisself by something else, which was like enough the case, as most everybody is crooked nowadays, but surely no decent person can blame me for that. I assured her that she was in no wise to blame. From this house in Young Street, the author of Vanity Fair moved to number 36 Onslow Square, where he wrote The Virginians. On the south side of the square there is a row of 3-storied brick houses. Thackeray lived in one of these houses for 9 years. They were the years when honors and wealth were being heaped upon him, and he was worldling enough to let his wants keep pace with his ability to gratify them. He was made of the same sort of clay as other men, for his standard of life conformed to his pocketbook, and he always felt poor. From this fine house on Onslow Square he moved to a veritable palace, which he built to suit his own taste, at number 2 Palace Green, Kensington. But mansions on earth are seldom for long. He died here on Christmas Eve, 1863, and Charles Dickens, Mark Lemon, Millier, Trollope, Robert Browning, Cruikshank, Tom Taylor, Louis Blanc, Charles Matthews, and Shirley Brooks were among the friends who carried him to his rest. End of Part 1 of William M. Thackeray. Section 23 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Elbert Hubbard. William M. Thackeray, Part 2. To take oneself too seriously is a great mistake. Complacency is the unpardonable sin, and the man who says, "Now I'm sure of it," has at that moment lost it. Villagers who have lived in one place until they think themselves great, having lost the sense of proportion through lack of comparison, are generally in dead earnest. Surely they are often intellectually dead, and I do not dispute the fact that they are in earnest. All those excellent gentlemen in the days gone by who could not contemplate a celestial bliss that did not involve the damnation of those who disagreed with them were in dead earnest. Cotton Mather once saw a black cat perched on the shoulder of an innocent, chattering old grandma. The next day a neighbor had a convulsion, and Cotton Mather went forth and exorcised Tabby with a hymn book, and hanged grandma by the neck high on Gallows Hill until she was dead. Had the Reverend Mr. Mather possessed but a mere modicum of humour, he might have exorcised the cat, but I'm sure he would never have troubled old grandma. But alas, Cotton Mather's conversation was limited to yea, yea, and nay, nay, generally nay, nay, and he was in dead earnest. In the Boston Public Library is a book written in 1685 by Cotton Mather entitled Wonders of the Invisible World. This book received the endorsement of the governor of the province and also of the president of Harvard College. The author cites many cases of persons who were bewitched, and also makes the interesting statement that the devil knows Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, but speaks English with an accent. These facts were long used at Harvard as an argument in favor of the classics, and when Greek was at last made optional, the devil was supposed to have filed a protest with the dean of the faculty. The Reverend Francis Gastrell, who raised New Place and cut down the poet's mulberry tree to escape the importunities of visitors, was in dead earnest. Attila and Herod and John Calvin were in dead earnest, and were it not for the fact that Luther had lucid intervals when he went about with his tongue in his cheek, he surely would have worked grievous wrong. Recent discoveries in Egyptian archaeology shows that in his lifetime Moses was esteemed more as a wit than as a lawmaker. His jokes were posted upon the walls and explained to the populace, who it seems were a bit slow. Job was a humorist of a high order, and when he said to the wise men, "No doubt but ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you," he struck 12. When the sons of Jacob went down into Egypt, and Joseph put up the price of corn, took their money, and then secretly replaced the coin in the sacks, he showed his artless love of a quiet joke. Shakespeare's fools were the wisest and kindliest men at court. When the master decked a character in cap and bells, it was as though he had given bonds for the man's humanity. Touchstone followed his master into exile, and when all seemed to have forsaken King Lear, the fool bared himself to the storm and covered the shaking old man with his own cloak. And if Costard, Trinculo, Touchstone, Jacques, and Mercutio had lived in Salem in 1692, there would have been not only a flashing of merry jests, but a flashing of rapiers as well, and every gray hair of every old dame's head would have been safe so long as there was a striped leg on which to stand. Lincoln, liberator of men, loved the motley. In fact, the individual who is incapable of viewing the world from a jocular basis is unsafe, and can be trusted only when the opposition is strong enough to laugh him into line. In the realm of English letters, Thackeray is prince of humorists. He could see right through a brick wall, and never mistook a hawk for a Hernshaw. He had a just estimate of values, and the temperament that can laugh at all trivial misfits. And he had, too, that dread capacity for pain which every true humorist possesses, for the true essence of humor is sensibility. In all literature that lives there is mingled, like pollen, an indefinable element of the author's personality. In Thackeray's Lectures on English Humorists this subtle quality is particularly apparent. Elusive, delicate, alluring, it is the actinic ray that imparts vitality. When wit plays skittles with dullness, dullness gets revenge by taking wit at his word. Vast numbers of people, taking Thackeray at his word, consider him a bitter pessimist. He even disconcerted bright little Charlotte Bronte, who went down to London to see him, and then wrote back to Haworth that the great man talked steadily, with never a smile. I could not tell when to laugh and when to cry, for I did not know what was fun and what fact. But finally the author of Jane Eyre found the combination, and she saw that beneath the brusque exterior of that bulky form there was a woman's tender sympathy. Thackeray has told us what he thought of the author of Jane Eyre, and the author of Jane Eyre has told us what she thought of the author of Vanity Fair. One was big and whimsical, the other was little and sincere, but both were alike in this: their hearts were wrung at the sight of suffering, and both had tears for the erring, the groping, and the oppressed. A Frenchman cannot comprehend a joke that is not accompanied by grimace and gesticulation, and so M. Taine chases Thackeray through 60 solid pages, berating him for what he is pleased to term bottled hate. Taine is a cynic who charges Thackeray with cynicism, all in the choicest of biting phrase. It is a beautiful example of sinners calling the righteous to repentance, a thing that is often done, but seldom with artistic finish. The fun is too deep for Monsieur, or mayhap the brand is not the yellow label to which his palate is accustomed, so he spews it all. Yet Taine's criticism is charming reading, although he is only hot after an aniseed trail of his own dragging. But the chase is a deal more exciting than most men would lead were there real live game to capture. If pushed, I might suggest several points in this man's make-up where God could have bettered his work. But accepting Thackeray as we find him, we see a singer whose cage fate has overhung with black until he has caught the tune. The ballad of Bouillabaisse shows a tender side of his spirit that he often sought to conceal. His heart vibrated to all finer thrills of mercy, and his love for all created things was so delicately strung that he would, in childish shame, sometimes issue a growl to drown its rising tearful tones. In the character of Becky Sharp, he has marshalled some of his own weak points, and then lashed them with scorn. He looked into the mirror, and seeing a potential snob, he straightway inveighed against snobbery. The punishment does not always fit the crime. It is excess. But I still contest that where his ridicule is most severe, it is Thackeray's own back that is bared to the knout. The primal recipe for roguery in art is, know thyself. When a writer portrays a villain and does it well, make no mistake, he poses for the character himself. Said gentle Ralph Waldo Emerson, I have capacity in me for every crime. The man of imagination knows those mystic spores of possibility that lie dormant, and like the magicians of the East, who grow mango trees in an hour, he develops the inward potential at will. The mere artisan in letters goes forth and finds a villain, and then describes him. But the artist knows a better way. I am that man. One of the very sweetest, gentlest characters in literature is Colonel Newcome, the stepfather of Thackeray. Major Carmichael Smythe was made to stand for the portrait of the lovable colonel, and when that all-round athlete, F. Hopkinson Smith, gave us that other lovable old colonel, he paid high tribute to the Newcomes. Thackeray was a poet, and as such was often caught in the toils of doubt, the crux of the inquiring spirit. He aspired for better things, and at times his imperfections stood out before him in monstrous shape, and he sought to hiss them down. In the heart of the artist-poet there is an inmost self that sits over against the acting, breathing man, and passes judgment on his every deed. To satisfy the world is little. To please the populace is naught. Fame is vapor, gold is dross, and every love that has not the sanction of that inmost self is a viper's sting. To satisfy the demands of the God within is the poet's prayer. What doubts beset, what taunting fears surround, what crouching sorrows lie in wait, what dead hopes drag, what hot desires pursue, and what kindly lights do beckon on, ah, 'tis we musicians know. Thackeray came to America to get a pot of money, and was in a fair way of securing it, when he chanced to pick up a paper in which a steamer was announced to sail that evening for England. A wave of homesickness swept over the big boy. He could not stand it. He hastily packed up his effects, and without saying good-bye to anyone, and forgetting all his engagements, he hastened to the dock, leaving this note for the kindest of kind friends. "Good-bye, Fields. Good-bye, Mrs. Fields. God bless everybody," says W.M.T. End of William M. Thackeray.
Section 24 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1 by Albert Hubbard. Section 24. Charles Dickens. I hope for the enlargement of my mind, and for the improvement of my understanding. If I have done but little good, I trust I have done less harm, and that none of my adventures will be other than a source of amusing and pleasant recollection. God bless you all. Pickwick. The path of progress in certain problems seems barred as by a flaming sword. More than 1,000 years before Christ, an Arab chief asked, "If a man dies, shall he live again?" Every man who ever lived has asked the same question, but we know no more today about the subject than did Job. There are 105 boy babies born to every 100 girls. The law holds in every land where vital statistics have been kept, and Sary Gamp knew just as much about the cause why as Brown Sicard, Pasteur, Agnew, or Austin Flint. There is still a third question that every parent, since Adam and Eve, has sought to solve. How can I educate this child so that he will attain eminence? And even in spite of shelves that groan beneath tomes and tomes, and advice from a million preachers, the answer is, nobody knows. There is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. Moses was sent adrift, but the tide carried him into power. The brethren of Joseph deposited him into a cavity, but you cannot dispose of genius that way. Demosthenes was weighted, or blessed, with every disadvantage. Shakespeare got into difficulty with a woman 8 years his senior, stole deer, ran away, and became the very first among English poets. Erasmus was a foundling. Once there was a woman by the name of Nancy Hanks. She was thin-breasted, gaunt, yellow, and sad. At last, living in poverty, overworked, she was stricken by death. She called her son, homely as herself, and pointing to the lad's sister, said, "Be good to her, Abe," and died having no expectation for her boy beyond the hope that he might prosper in worldly affairs so as to care for himself and his sister. The boy became a man who wielded wisely a power mightier than that ever given to any other American. 7 college-bred men composed his cabinet, and Proctor Knott once said that, if a teeter were evenly balanced, and the members of the cabinet were all placed on one end, and the president on the other, he would send the 7 wise men flying into space. On the other hand, Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations for a son who did not read them, and whose name is a symbol of profligacy. Charles Kingsley penned Greek heroes for offspring who have never shown their father's heroism, and Charles Dickens wrote A Child's History of England for his children, none of whom has proven his proficiency in historiology. Charles Dickens himself received his education at the University of Hard Knocks. Very early in life he was cast upon the rocks and suckled by the she-wolf. Yet he became the most popular author the world has ever known, and up to the present time no writer of books has approached him in point of number of readers and of financial returns. These are facts. Facts so hard and true that they would be the delight of Mr. Gradgrind. At 12 years of age Charles Dickens was pasting labels on blacking boxes. His father was in prison. At 16 he was spending odd hours in the reading room of the British Museum. At 19 he was parliamentary reporter. At 21 a writer of sketches. At 23 he was getting a salary of $35 a week, and the next year his pay was doubled. When 25 he wrote a play that ran for 70 nights at Drury Lane Theatre. About the same time he received $700 for a series of sketches written in 2 weeks. At 26 publishers were at his feet. When Dickens was at the flood tide of prosperity, Thackeray, 1 year his senior, waited on his doorstep with pictures to illustrate Pickwick. He worked steadily and made from $8,000 to $25,000 a year. His fame increased, and the New York Ledger paid him $10,000 for one story which he wrote in a fortnight. His collected works fill 40 volumes. There are more of Dickens' books sold every year now than in any year in which he lived. There were more of Dickens' books sold last year than any previous year. "I am glad that the public buys his books," says Macready, "for if they did not, he would take to the stage and eclipse us all." Not So Bad as We Seem, by Bulwer Lytton, was played at Devonshire House in the presence of the Queen, Dickens taking the principal part. He gave theatrical performances in London, Liverpool, and Manchester, for the benefit of Leigh Hunt, Sheridan Knowles, and various other needy authors and actors. He wrote a dozen plays, and twice as many more have been constructed from his plots. He gave public readings through England, Scotland, and Ireland, where the people fought for seats. The average receipts for these entertainments were $800 per night. In 1863 he made a 6 months' tour of the United States, giving a series of readings. The prices of admission were placed at extravagant figures, but the box office was always besieged until the ticket seller put out his lights and hung out a sign, "The standing room is all taken." The gross receipts of these readings were $229,000, the expenses $39,000, net profit $190,000. Charles Dickens died of brain rupture in 1870, aged 58. His dust rests in Westminster Abbey. "To know the London of Dickens is a liberal education," once said James T. Fields, who was affectionately referred to by Charles Dickens as Massachusetts Jemmy. And I am aware of no better way to become acquainted with the greatest city in the world than to follow the winding footsteps of the author of David Copperfield. Beginning his London life when 10 years of age, he shifted from one lodging to another, zigzag, tacking back and forth from place to place, but all the time making head, and finally dwelling in palaces of which nobility might be proud. It took him 48 years to travel from the squalor of Camden Town to Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. He lodged first in Bayham Street. A washerwoman lived next door, and a Bow Street officer over the way. It was a shabby district chosen by the elder Dickens because the rent was low. As he neglected to pay the rent, one wonders why he did not take quarters in Piccadilly. I looked in vain for a sign reading, "Washin' done here," but I found a Bow Street officer who told me that Bayham Street had long since disappeared. Yet there is always a recompense in prowling about London, because if you do not find the thing you are looking for, you find something else equally interesting. My Bow Street friend proved to be a regular magazine of rare and useful information, historical, archaeological, and biographical. A London bobby has his clothes cut after a pattern 100 years old, and he always carries his gloves in his hand, never wearing them, because this was a habit of William the Conqueror. But never mind, he is intelligent, courteous, and obliging, and I am perfectly willing that he should wear skirts like a ballet dancer, and a helmet too small, if it is his humor. My policeman knew an older officer who was acquainted with Mr. Dickens. Mr. Dickens 'ad a fur policeman suit himself, issued to him on an order from Scotland Yard, and he used to do patrol duty at night, carrying his bloomin' gloves in his 'and and his chin strap in place. This was told me by my new-found friend, who volunteered to show me the way to North Gower Street. It's only Gower Street now, and the houses have been renumbered, so number 4 is a matter of conjecture, but my guide showed me a door where were the marks of a full-grown plate that evidently had long since disappeared. Some days afterward I found this identical brass plate at an old bookshop in Cheapside. The plate read, "Mrs. Dickens' Establishment." The man who kept the place advertised himself as a bibliopole. He offered to sell me the plate for £1.10, but I did not purchase, for I knew where I could get its mate with a deal more verdigris, all for 6 and 8. Dickens has recorded that he cannot recollect of any pupils coming to the establishment, but he remembers when his father was taken, like Mr. Dorrit, to the debtors' prison. He was lodged in the top story but one, in the very same room where his son afterwards put the Dorrits. It's a queer thing to know that a book writer can imprison folks without a warrant, and even kill them, and yet go unpunished, which thought was suggested to me by my philosophic guide. From this house in Gower Street, Charles used to go daily to the Marshalsea to visit Micawber, who not so many years later was to act as the proud amanuensis of his son. The next morning after I first met Bobby he was off duty. I met him by appointment at the Three Jolly Beggars, a place pernicious snug. He was dressed in a fashionable, light-colored suit, the coat a trifle short, and a high silk hat. His large red neck-scarf, set off by his bright, brick-dust complexion, caused me to mistake him at first for a friend of mine who drives a Holborn bus. Mr. 'Awkins, for it was he, greeted me cordially, pulling gently at his neck-whiskers, and when he addressed me as "me lud," the barmaid served us with much alacrity and things. We went first to the Church of St. George, then we found Angel Court leading to Bermondsey, and also Marshalsea Place. Here is the site of the prison, where the crowded ghosts of misery still hover, but small trace could we find of the prison itself, neither did we see the ghosts. We, however, saw a very pretty barmaid at the public in Angel Court. I think she is still prettier than the one to whom Bobby introduced me at the sign of the meat axe, which is saying a good deal. Angel Court is rightly named. The blacking warehouse at Old Hungerford Stairs, Strand, in which Charles Dickens was shown by Bob Fagin how to tie up the pots of paste, has rotted down and been carted away. The coal barges in the muddy river are still there, just as they were when Charles, Paul Green, and Bob Fagin played on them during the dinner hour. I saw Bob and several other boys, grimy with blacking, chasing each other across the flatboats, but Dickens was not there. Down the river a ways there is a crazy old warehouse with a rotten wharf of its own, abutting on the water when the tide is in, and on the mud when the tide is out, the whole place literally overrun with rats that scuffle and squeal on the mouldy stairs. I asked Bobby if it could not be that this was the blacking factory, but he said, "No, for this one allus was." Dickens found lodging in Lant Street while his father was awaiting in the Marshalsea for something to turn up. Bob Sawyer afterward had the same quarters. When Sawyer invited Mr. Pickwick and the other chaps to dine with him, he failed to give his number, so we cannot locate the house. But I found the street and saw a big wooden Pickwick on wheels standing as a sign for a tobacco shop. The old gentleman who runs the place, and runs the sign in every night, assured me that Bob Sawyer's room was the first floor back. I looked in at it, but seeing no one was there whom I knew, I bought tuppence worth of pigtail in lieu of fee, and came away. If a man wished to abstract himself from the world, to remove himself from temptation, to place himself beyond the possibility of desire to look out of the window, he should live in Lant Street, said a great novelist. David Copperfield lodged here when he ordered that glass of genuine stunning ale at the Red Lion, and excited the sympathy of the landlord, winning a motherly kiss from his wife. The Red Lion still crouches, under another name, at the corner of Derby and Parliament Streets, Westminster. I daydreamed there for an hour one morning, pretending the while to read a newspaper. I cannot, however, recommend their ale as particularly stunning. As there are authors of one book, so there are readers of one author, more than we wist. Children want the same bear story over and over, preferring it to a new one. So grown-ups often prefer the dog-eared book to uncut leaves. Mr. Hawkins preferred the dog-eared, and at the station house, where many times he had long hours to wait in anticipation of a hurry-up call, he whiled away the time by browsing in his Dickens. He knew no other author, neither did he wish to. His epidermis was soaked with Dickensology, and when inspired by gin and bitters, he emitted information at every pore. To him, all these bodiless beings of Dickens' brain were living creatures. An anachronism was nothing to Hawkins. Charlie Bates was still at large, Quilp was just around the corner, and Gaffer Hexam's boat was moored in the muddy river below. Dickens used to haunt the publics, those curious resting places where all sorts and conditions of thirsty philosophers meet to discuss all sorts of themes. My guide took me to many of these inns, which the great novelist frequented, and we always had one legend with every drink. After we had called at 3 or 4 different snuggeries, Hawkins would begin to shake out the facts. Now it is not generally known that the so-called stories of Dickens are simply records of historic events, like What Do You Call 'Em's plays. For instance, Dombey and Son was a well-known firm who carried over into a joint stock company only a few years ago. The concern is now known as the Dombey Trading Company. They occupy the same quarters that were used by their illustrious predecessors. I signified a desire to see the counting house so minutely described by Dickens, and Mr. Hawkins agreed to pilot me thither on our way to Tavistock Square. We twisted down to the first turning, then up 3, then straight ahead to the first right-hand turn, where we cut to the left until we came to a stuffed dog, which is the sign of a Glover. Just beyond this, my guide plucked me by the sleeve. We halted, and he silently and solemnly pointed across the street. Sure enough, there it was, the warehouse with a great stretch of dirty windows in front, through which we could see dozens of clerks bending over ledgers just as though Mr. Dombey were momentarily expected. Over the door was a gilt sign, the Bombay Trading Company. Bobby explained that it was all the same. I did not care to go in, but at my request Hawkins entered and asked for Mr. Carker, the junior, but no one knew him. Then we dropped in at the Silver Shark, a little inn about the size of a large dustbin, of 2 compartments and a sifter. Here we rested a bit, as we had walked a long way. The barmaid who waited upon us was in curl papers, but she was even then as pretty, if not prettier, than the barmaid at the public in Angel Court, and that is saying a good deal. She was about as tall as Trilby, or as Ellen Terry, which is a very nice height, I think. As we rested, Mr. Hawkins told the barmaid and me how Rogue Riderhood came to this very public, through that same doorway, just after he had his Alfred David took down by the governors both. He was a slouching dog, was the Rogue. He wore an old sodden fur cap, winter and summer, formless and mangy. It looked like a drowned cat. His hands were always in his pockets up to his elbows, when they were not reaching for something, and when he was out after game his walk was a half shuffle and run. Hawkins saw him starting off this way one night and followed him, knowing there was mischief on hand, followed him for 2 hours through the fog and rain. It was midnight and the last stroke of the bells that told the hour had ceased, and their echo was dying away when, all at once— But the story is too long to relate here. It is so long that when Mr. Hawkins had finished it was too late to reach Tavistock Square before dark. Mr. Hawkins explained that as bats and owls and rats come out only when the sun has disappeared, so there are other things that can be seen best by night. And as he did not go on until the next day at 1, he proposed that we should go down to the Cheshire Cheese and get a bite of summit and then sally forth. So we hailed a bus and climbed to the top. "She rolls like a scow in the wake of a liner," said Bobby, as we tumbled into seats. When the busman came up the little winding ladder and jingled his punch, Hawkins paid our fares with a heavy wink, and the guard said, "Thank you, sir," and passed on. End of Section 24. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California. Section 25 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1 by Elbert Hubbard. Section 25. We got off at the Cheese and settled ourselves comfortably in a corner. The same seats are there running along the wall where Dr. Johnson, Goldie, and Boswell so often sat and waked the echoes with their laughter. We had chops and tomato sauce in recollection of Jingle and Trotter. The chops were of that delicious kind unknown outside of England. I supplied the legend this time, for my messmate had never heard of Boswell. Hawkins introduced me to the cove in the white apron, who waited upon us, and then explained that I was the man who wrote Martin Chuzzlewit. He kissed his hand to the elderly woman who presided behind the nickel-plated American cash register. The only thing that rang false about the place was that register, perked up there spick-span new. Hawkins insisted that it was a typewriter, and as we passed out he took a handful of matches, thinking them toothpicks, and asked the cashier to play a tune on the thingamabob, but she declined. We made our way to London Bridge as the night was settling down. No stars came out, but flickering, fluttering gaslights appeared, and around each post was a great, gray, fluffy aureole of mist. Just at the entrance to the bridge we saw Nancy dogged by Noah Claypole. They turned down towards Billingsgate Fish Market, and as the fog swallowed them, Hawkins answered my question as to the language used at Billingsgate. "It's not so bloomin' bad, you know. Why, I'll take you to a market in Islington where they talk twice as vile." He started to go into technicalities, but I excused him. Then he leaned over the parapet and spat down at a rowboat that was passing below. As the boat moved out into the glimmering light, we made out Lizzie Hexam at the oars, while Gaffer sat in the stern on the lookout. The Marchioness went by as we stood there, a bit of a tattered shawl over her frowsy head, one stocking down around her shoe top. She had a penny loaf under her arm, and was breaking off bits, eating as she went. Soon came Snagsby, then Mr. Vincent Crummles, Mr. Sleary, the horseback rider, followed by Chops, the dwarf, and Pickleson, the giant. Hawkins said there were 2 Picklesons, but I saw only one. Just below was the stone pier, and there stood Mrs. Gamp, and I heard her ask, "And which of them smoking monsters is the Anxworth boat, I wonder? Goodness me!" "Which boat do you want?" asked Ruth. "The Anxworks package. I will not deceive you, sweet. Why should I?" "Why, that is the Antwerp packet, in the middle," said Ruth. "And I wish it was in Jonnage's belly, I do," cried Mrs. Gamp. We came down from the bridge, moved over toward Billingsgate, past the custom house, where curious old sea captains wait for ships that never come. Captain Cuttle lifted his hook to the brim of his glazed hat as we passed. We returned the salute and moved on toward the tower. "It's a rum place, let's not stop," said Hawkins. Thoughts of the ghosts of Raleigh, of Mary Queen of Scots, and of Lady Jane Grey seemed to steady his gait and to hasten his footsteps. In a few moments we saw just ahead of us David Copperfield and Mr. Peggotty, following a woman whom we could make out walking excitedly a block ahead. It was Martha, intent on suicide. "We'll get to the dock first and 'ead her off," said 'Awkins. We ran down a side street, but a bright light in a little brick cottage caught our attention. Men can't run arm in arm anyway. We forgot our errand of mercy and stood still with open mouths looking in at the window at little Jenny Wren, hard at work dressing her dolls and stopping now and then to stab the air with her needle. Bradley Headstone and Charlie and Lizzie Hexam came in, and we then passed on, not wishing to attract attention. There was an old smoke-stained tree on the corner which I felt sorry for, as I do for every city tree. Just beyond was a blacksmith's forge and a timber yard behind, where a dealer in old iron had a shop, in front of which was a rusty boiler and a gigantic flywheel half buried in the sand. There were no crowds to be seen now, but we walked on, generally in the middle of the narrow streets, turning up or down or across, through arches where tramps slept, by doorways where children crouched, passing drunken men and women with shawls over their heads. Now and again the screech of a fiddle could be heard, or the lazy music of an accordion, coming from some sailor's home. Steps of dancing with rattle of iron-shod boot heels clicking over sanded floors, the hoarse shout of the collar off, and now and again angry tones with cracked feminine falsettos broke on the air. And all the time the soft rain fell, and steam seemed to rise from the sewage-laden streets. We were in Stepney, that curious parish so minutely described by Walter Besant in All Sorts and Conditions of Men, the parish where all children born at sea were considered to belong. We saw Brig Place, where Walter Gay visited Captain Cuttle. Then we went with Pip in search of Mrs. Wimple's house at Mill Pond Bank, Chinks Basin, Old Green Copper Rope Walk, where lived old Billy Barley and his daughter Clara, and where Magwitch was hidden. It was the dingiest collection of shabby buildings ever squeezed together in a dark corner as a club for tomcats. Then, standing out in the gloom, we saw Limehouse Church, where John Rokesmith prowled about on a 'tective scent, and where John Harmon waited for the third mate Radfoot, intending to murder him. Next we reached Limehouse Hole, where Rogue Riderhood took the plunge down the steps of Leaving Shop. Hawkins thought he saw the Artful Dodger ahead of us on the dock. He went over and looked up and down and under an old upturned rowboat, then peered over the dock and swore a harmless oath that if he could catch him we could run him in without a warrant. Yes, we'd clap the nippers on him and march him orf. Not if I can help it, I said. I like the fellow too well. Fortunately Hawkins failed to find him. Here it was that the uncommercial traveler did patrol duty on many sleepless nights. Here it was that Esther Summerson and Mr. Bucket came. And by the light of a match held under my hat we read a handbill on the brick wall. Found, drowned. The heading stood out in big fat letters, but the print below was too damp to read. Yet there is no doubt it is the same bill that Gaffer Hexam, Eugene Rayburn, and Mortimer Lightwood read, for Mr. Hawkins said so. As we stood there we heard the gentle gurgle of the tide running under the pier, then a dip of oars coming from out the murky darkness of the muddy river. A challenge from the shore with orders to row in, a hoarse, defiant answer, and a watchman's rattle. A policeman passed us running and called back, "I say, Hawkins, is that you? There's murder broke loose in Whitechapel again. The reserves have been ordered out." Hawkins stopped and seemed to pull himself together. His height increased 3 inches. A moment before I thought he was a candidate for fatty degeneration of the cerebrum, but now his sturdy frame was all a-tremble with life. "Another murder! I knew it! Bill Sykes has killed Nancy at last. There's 50 pun for the man who puts the irons on him. I must make for the nearest station." He gave my hand a twist, shot down a narrow courtway, and I was left to fight the fog, and mayhap this Bill Sykes and all the other wild phantoms of Dickens' brain, alone. A certain great general once said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Just why the maxim should be limited to aborigines I know not, for when one reads obituaries he is discouraged at the thoughts of competing in virtue with those who have gone hence. Let us extend the remark, plagiarize a bit, and say that the only perfect men are those whom we find in books. The receipt for making them is simple, yet well worth pasting in your scrapbook. Take the virtues of all the best men you ever knew or heard of, leave out the faults, then mix. In the hands of the lady novelist this composition, well molded, makes a scarecrow, in the hair of which the birds of the air come and build their nests. But manipulated by an expert, a figure may appear that starts and moves and seems to feel the thrill of life. It may even take its place on a pedestal and be exhibited with other waxworks and thus become confounded with the historic. And though these things make the unskillful laugh, yet the judicious say, "Dickens made it, therefore let it pass for a man." Dear old M. Taine, ever glad to score a point against the British, and willing to take Dickens at his word, says, "We have no such men in France as Scrooge and Squeers." But, God bless you, M. Taine, England has no such men either. The novelist takes the men and women he has known, and from life, plus imagination, he creates. If he sticks too close to nature, he describes, not depicts. This is veritism. If imagination's wing is too strong, it lifts the luckless writer off from earth and carries him to an unknown land. You may then fall down and worship his characters, and there is no violation of the first commandment. Nothing can be imagined that has not been seen, but imagination can assort, omit, sift, select, construct. Given a horse, an eagle, an elephant, and the creative artist can make an animal that is neither a horse, an eagle, nor an elephant, yet resembles each. This animal may have 8 legs, or 40, with hoofs, claws, and toes alternating, a beak, a trunk, a mane, and the whole can be feathered and given the power of rapid flight, and also the ability to run like the east wind. It can neigh, roar, or scream by turn, or can do it all in concert, with a vibratory force multiplied by 1,000. The novelist must have lived, and the novelist must have imagination. But this is not enough. He must have power to analyze and separate, and then he should have the good taste to select and group, forming his parts into a harmonious whole. Yet he must build large. Life-size will not do. The statue must be heroic, and the artist's genius must breathe into its nostrils the breath of life. The men who live in history are those whose lives have been skillfully written. Plutarch is the most charming writer of fiction the world has ever known, said Emerson. Dickens' characters are personifications of traits, not men and women. Yet they are a deal funnier, They are as funny as a box of monkeys, as entertaining as a Punch and Judy show, as interesting as a 15 puzzle, and sometimes as pretty as Chromos. Quilp munching the eggs, shell and all, to scare his wife, makes one shiver as though a jack-in-the-box had been popped out at him. Mr. Mould, the undertaker, and Jaggers, the lawyer, are as amusing as Humpty Dumpty and Pantaloon. I am sure that no live lawyer ever gave me half the enjoyment that Jaggers has, and Dr. Slammer's talk is better medicine than the pills of any living M.D. Because the burnt cork minstrel pleases me more than the real nigger is no reason why I should find fault. Dickens takes the horse, the eagle, and the elephant, and makes an animal of his own. He rubs up the feathers, places the tail at a fierce angle, makes the glass eyes glare, and you are ready to swear that the thing is alive. By rummaging over the commercial world you can collect the harshness, greed, avarice, selfishness, and vanity from 1,000 men. With these sins you can, if you are very skillful, construct a Ralph Nickleby, a Scrooge, a Jonas Chuzzlewit, an Alderman Cute, a Mr. Murdstone, a Bounderby, or a Gradgrind at will. A little more pride, a little less hypocrisy, a molecule extra of untruth, and flavor this fault or that, and your man is ready to place up against the fence to dry. Then you can make a collection of all the ridiculous traits, the whims, silly pride, foibles, hopes founded on nothing, and dreams touched with moonshine, and you can make a Micawber. Put in a dash of assurance and a good thimbleful of hypocrisy, and Pecksniff's is the product. Leave out the assurance, replacing it with cowardice, and the result is Dr. Chillip or Uriah Heep. Muddle the whole with stupidity, and Bumble comes forth. Then, for the good people, collect the virtues and season to suit the taste, and we have the Cheeryble brothers, Paul Dombey or Little Nell. They have no development, therefore no history. The circumstances under which you meet them vary, that's all. They are people the like of whom are never seen on land or sea. Little Nell is good all day long, while live children are good for only 5 minutes at a time. The recurrence with which these 5-minute periods return determines whether the child is good or bad. In the intervals, the restless little feet stray into flower beds, stand on chairs so that grimy dimpled hands may reach forbidden jam, run and romp in pure joyous innocence, or kick spitefully at authority. Then the little fellow may go to sleep, smile in his dreams so that Mama says angels are talking to him. Nurse says wind on the stomach. When he awakens, the 5-minute good spell returns. Men are only grown-up children. They are cheerful after breakfast, cross at night. Houses, lands, barns, railroads, churches, books, racetracks are the playthings with which they amuse themselves until they grow tired, and death, the kind old nurse, puts them to sleep. So a man on earth is good or bad as mood moves him. In color his acts are seldom pure white, neither are they wholly black, but generally of a steel gray. Caprice, temper, accident, all act upon him. The north wind of hate, the simoon of jealousy, the cyclone of passion beat and buffet him. Pilots strong and pilots cowardly stand at the helm by turn. But sometimes the south wind softly blows, the sun comes out by day, the stars at night. Friendship holds the rudder firm, and love makes all secure. Such is the life of man, a voyage on life's unresting sea. But Dickens knows it not. Esther is always good, Fagin is always bad, Bumble is always pompous, and Scrooge is always Scrooge. At no Dickens party do you ever mistake Cheeryble for Carker, yet in real life Carker is Carker one day and Cheeryble the next. Yes, Carker in the morning and Cheeryble after dinner. There is no doubt that a dummy so ridiculous as Pecksniff has reduced the number of hypocrites, and the domineering and unjust are not quite so popular since Dickens painted their picture with a broom. From the yeasty deep of his imagination he conjured forth his strutting spirits, and the names he gave to each are as fitting and as funny as the absurd small clothes and fluttering ribbons which they wear. Shakespeare has his Gobbo, Touchstone, Simcox, Sly, Grumio, Mopsa, Pinch, Nym, Simple, Quickly, Overdone, Elbow Froth, Dogberry, Puck, Pea-blossom, Taurus, Bottom, Bushy, Hotspur, Scroop, Wall, Flute, Snout, Starveling, Moonshine, Mouldy, Shallow, Wart, Bullcalf, Feeble, Quince, Snag, Dull, Mustard-seed, Fang, Snare, Rumour, Tearsheet, Cobweb, Costard, and Moth. But in names as well as in plot, the father of Pickwick has distanced the master. In fact, to give all the odd and whimsical names invented by Dickens would be to publish a book, for he compiled an indexed volume of names from which he drew at will. He used, however, but a fraction of his list. The rest are wisely kept from the public, else, forsooth, the fledgling writers of penny shockers would seize upon them for raw stock. Dickens has a watch that starts and stops in a way of its own, never mind the sun. He lets you see the wheels go round, but he never tells you why the wheels go round. He knows little of psychology, that curious unseen thing that stands behind every act. He knows not the highest love, therefore he never depicts the highest joy. Nowhere does he show the gradual awakening in man of godlike passion. Nowhere does he show the evolution of a soul. Very, very seldom does he touch the sublime. But he has given the Athenians a day of pleasure, and for this let us all reverently give thanks. End of section 25. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.
Section 26 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1 by Albert Hubbard. Oliver Goldsmith, Part 1. Jarvis. Few of our usual cards of compliments, that's all. This bill from your tailor, this from your mercer, and this from the little broker in Crooked Lane. He says he has been at a great deal of trouble to get back the money you borrowed. Honeydew. But I am sure we were at a great deal of trouble in getting him to lend it. Jarvis. He has lost all patience. Honeydew. Then he has lost a good thing. Jarvis. There's that 10 guineas you were sending to the poor man and his children in the fleet. I believe that would stop his mouth for a while. Honeydew. Ay, Jarvis, but what will fill their mouths in the meantime? Goldsmith. The Good-Natured Man. The Isle of Arran has the same number of square miles as the state of Indiana. It also has more kindness to the acre than any other country on earth. Ireland has 5 million inhabitants. Once it had 8. 3 millions have gone away, and when one thinks of landlordism, he wonders why the 5 millions did not go too. But the Irish are a poetic people, and love the land of their fathers with a childlike love, and their hearts are all bound up in sweet memories, rooted by song and legend into nooks and curious corners, so the tendrils of affection hold them fast. Ireland is very beautiful. Its pasture lands and meadow lands, blossom-decked and water-fed, crossed and recrossed by never-ending hedgerows that stretch away and lose themselves in misty nothingness, are fair as a poet's dream. Birds carol in the white hawthorn and the yellow furze all day long, and the fragrant summer winds that blow lazily across the fields are laden with the perfume of fairest flowers. It is like crossing the dark river called Death, to many, to think of leaving Ireland. Besides that, even if they wanted to go, they haven't money to buy a steerage ticket. From across the dark river called Death come no remittances, but from America many dollars are sent back to Ireland. This often supplies the obolus that secures the necessary bit of Cunard passport. Whenever an Irishman embarks at Queenstown, part of the 5 million inhabitants go down to the waterside to see him off. Not long ago I stood with the crowd and watched 2 fine lads go up the gangplank, each carrying a red handkerchief containing his worldly goods. As the good ship moved away, we lifted a wild wail of woe that drowned the sobbing of the waves. Everybody cried. I wept too. And, as the great black ship became but a speck on the western horizon, we embraced each other in frenzied grief. There is beauty in Ireland, physical beauty of so rare and radiant a type that it makes the heart of an artist ache to think that it cannot endure. On country roads, at fair time, the traveller will see barefoot girls who are women, and just suspecting it, who have cheeks like ripe pippins, laughing eyes with long, dark, wicked lashes, teeth like ivory, necks of perfect poise, and waists that, never having known a corset, are pure Greek. Of course these girls are aware that we admire them. How could they help it? They carry big baskets on either shapely arm, bundles balanced on their heads, and we, suddenly grown tired, sit on the bankside as they pass by, and feign indifference to their charms. Once safely past, we admiringly examine their tracks in the soft mud, for there has been a shower during the night, and we vow that such footprints were never before left upon the sands of time. The typical young woman in Ireland is Juno before she was married. The old woman is Sycorax after Caliban was weaned. Wrinkled, toothless, yellow old hags are seen sitting by the roadside, rocking back and forth, crooning a song that is mate to the chant of the witches in Macbeth when they brew the hell broth. See that wizened, scarred, and cruel old face, how it speaks of a seared and bitter heart, so dull yet so alert, so changeful yet so impassive, so immobile yet so cunning, a paradox in wrinkles, where half-stifled desperation has clawed at the soul until it has fled, and only dead indifference or greedy expectation is left to tell the tragic tale. In the name of God, charity, kind gentlemen, charity. And the old crone stretches forth a long bony claw. Should you pass on, she calls down curses on your head. If you are wise, you go back and fling her a copper to stop the cold streaks that are shooting up your spine. And these old women were the most trying sights I saw in Ireland. Pshaw, said a friend of mine when I told him this. These old creatures are actors, and if you would sit down and talk to them, as I have done, they will laugh and joke and tell you of sons in America who are policemen, and then they will fill black duddeens out of your tobacco and ask if you know Mike McGuire, who lives in Shekajee. The last trace of comeliness has long left the faces of these repulsive beggars, but there is a type of feminine beauty that comes with years. It is found only where intellect and affection keep step with spiritual desire. And in Ireland, where it is often a crime to think, where superstition stalks, and avarice rules, and hunger crouches, it is very, very rare. But I met one woman in the Emerald Isle whose hair was snow white, and whose face seemed to beam a benediction. It was a countenance refined by sorrow, purified by aspiration, made peaceful by right intellectual employment, strong through self-reliance, and gentle by an earnest faith in things unseen. It proved the possible. When the nations are disarmed, Ireland will take first place, for in Fistiana she is supreme. James Russell Lowell once said that where the code duello exists, men lift their hats to ladies and say, "Excuse me," and "If you please." And if Lowell was so bold as to say a good word for the gentlemen, who hold themselves personally responsible, I may venture the remark that men who strike from the shoulder are almost universally polite to strangers. A woman can do Ireland afoot and alone with perfect safety. Everywhere one finds courtesy, kindness, and bubbling good cheer. 19/20 of all lawlessness in Ireland during the past 200 years has been directed against the landlord's agent. This is a very Irish-like proceeding, to punish the agent for the sins of the principal. When the landlord himself comes over from England, he affects a fatherly interest in his people. He gives out presents and cheap favors, and the people treat him with humble deference. When the landlord's agent goes to America, he gets a place as first mate on a Mississippi River steamboat, and before the war he was in demand in the South as overseer. He it is who has taught the buyers the villainy that they execute, and it sometimes goes hard, for they better the instruction. But there is one other character that the boys occasionally look after in Ireland, and that is the squire. He is a merry wight, in tight breeches, red coat, and a number 6 hat. He has yellow side whiskers and unts and ounds, riding over the wheat fields of honest men. The genuine landlord lives in London. The squire would like to, but cannot afford it. Of course, there are squires and squires, but the kind I have in mind is an Irishman who tries to pass for an Englishman. He is that curious thing, a man without a country. There is a theory to the effect that the universal mother in giving out happiness bestows on each and all an equal portion, that the beggar trudging along the stony road is as happy as the king who rides by in his carriage. This is a very old belief, and it has been held by many learned men. From the time I first heard it, it appealed to me as truth. Yet recently my faith has been shaken, for not long ago in New York I climbed the marble steps of a splendid mansion, and was admitted by a servant in livery, who carried my card on a silver tray to his master. This master had a son in the Keeley Institute, a daughter in her grave, and a wife who shrank from his presence. His heart was as lonely as a winter night at sea. Fate had sent him a coachman, a butler, a gardener, and a footman, but she took his happiness and passed it through a hole in the thatch of a mud-plastered cottage in Ireland, where each night 6 rosy children soundly slept in one straw bed. In that cottage I stayed 2 days. There was a stone floor and bare, whitewashed walls, but there was a rosebush climbing over the door, and within health and sunny temper that made mirth with a meal of herbs, and a tenderness that touched to poetry the prose of daily duties. But it is well to bear in mind that an Irishman in America and an Irishman in Ireland are not necessarily the same thing. Often the first effect of a higher civilization is degeneration. Just as the Chinaman quickly learns big swear words, and the Indian takes to drink, and certain young men on first reading Emerson's essay on self-reliance go about with a chip on their shoulders, so sometimes does the first full breath of freedom's air develop the worst in Paddy instead of the best. As one tramps through Ireland and makes the acquaintance of a blue-eyed broth of a bye, who weighs 190 and measures 44 inches around the chest, he catches glimpses of noble traits and hints of mystic possibilities. There are actions that look like rudiments of greatness gone, and you think of the days when Olympian games were played, and finger meanwhile the silver in your pocket, and inwardly place it on this 20-year-old, pink-faced, 6-foot boy that stands before you. In Ireland there are no forests, but in the peat bogs are found remains of mighty trees that once lifted their outstretched branches to the sun. Are these remains of stately forests symbols of a race of men that, too, have passed away? In any wayside village of Leinster you can pick you a model for an Apollo. He is in rags, is this giant, and cannot read, but he can dance and sing and fight. He has an eye for color, an ear for music, a taste for rhyme, a love of novelty, and a thirst for fun. And withal he has blundering sympathy and a pity whose tears are near the surface. Now, will this fine savage be a victim of arrested development, and sink gradually through weight of years into mere animal stupidity and sodden superstition? The chances are that this is just what he will do. and that at 20 he will be in his intellectual zenith. Summer does not fulfill the promise of spring. But as occasionally there is one of those beautiful, glowing Irish girls who leaves footsteps that endure in bettered lives, instead of merely transient tracks in mud, so there has been a Burke, a Wellington, an O'Connell, a Sheridan, a Tom Moore, and an Oliver Goldsmith. While Goldsmith was an Irishman, Swift was an Englishman who chanced to be born of Irish parents in Dublin. In comparing these men, Thackeray says, "I think I would rather have had a cold potato and a friendly word from Goldsmith than to have been beholden to the Dean for a guinea and a dinner." No, the Dean was not an Irishman, for no Irishman ever gave but with a kind word and a kind heart. Charles Goldsmith was a clergyman, passing rich on £40 a year. He had a nice little family of 8 children, and what became of the 7 who went not astray, I do not know. But the smallest and homeliest one of the brood became the best loved man in London. These sickly boys who have been educated only because they were too weak to work. What a record their lives make! Little Oliver had a pug nose and bandy legs, and fists not big enough to fight. But he had a large head, and because he was absent-minded, lots of folks thought him dull and stupid, and others were sure he was very bad. In fact, let us admit it, he did steal apples and rifle birds' nests, and on the straggling fence that skirts the way, he drew pictures of Paddy Byrne, the schoolmaster, who amazed the rustics by the amount of knowledge he carried in one small head. But Paddy Byrne did not love art for art's sake, so he applied the ferule vigorously to little Goldsmith's anatomy, with a hope of diverting the lad's inclinations from art to arithmetic. I do not think the plan was very successful, for the pock-marked youngster was often adorned with the dunce cap. "And, sir," said Dr. Johnson, many years after, "it must have been very becoming." It seems that Paddy Byrne boarded round, and part of the time was under the roof of the rectory. Now we all know that schoolmasters are dual creatures, and that once away from the schoolyard, and having laid aside the robe of office, are often good, honest, simple folks. In his official capacity, Paddy Byrne made things very uncomfortable for the pug-nosed little boy, but, like the true Irishman that he was, when he got away from the schoolhouse, he was sorry for it. Whether dignity is the mask we wear to hide ignorance, I am not sure, yet when Paddy Byrne was the schoolmaster, he was a man severe and stern to view, but when he was plain Paddy Byrne, he was a first-rate good fellow. Evenings he would hold little Oliver on his knee, and instead of helping him in his lessons, he would tell him tales of robbers, pirates, smugglers, everything and anything, in fact, that boys like. Stories of fairies, goblins, ghosts, lion hunts, and tiger killing, in which the redoubtable Paddy was supposed to have taken a chief part. The schoolmaster had been a soldier and a sailor. He had been in many lands, and when he related his adventures, no doubt he often mistook imagination for memory. But the stories had the effect of choking the desire in Oliver for useful knowledge, and gave instead a thirst for wandering and adventure. Byrne also had a taste for poetry, and taught the lad to scribble rhymes. Very proud was the boy's mother, and very carefully did she preserve these foolish lines. All this was in the village of Lissoy, County Westmeath. Yet if you look on the map you will look in vain for Lissoy. But 6 miles northeast from Athlone, and 3 miles from Ballymahone, is the village of Auburn. when Goldsmith was a boy, Lissoy was. Sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, where health and plenty cheered the laboring swain, where smiling spring the earliest visits paid, and parting summers lingering blooms delayed. Dear lovely bowers of innocence and ease, seats of my youth, when every sport could please. How often have I loitered over thy green, where humble happiness endeared each scene. How often have I paused on every charm, the sheltered cot, the cultivated farm, the never failing brook, the busy mill, the decent church that topped the neighboring hill, the hawthorn bush with seats beneath the shade, for talking age and whispering lovers made. How often have I blessed the coming day, when toil remitting lent its turn to play, and all the village train from labor free led up their sports beneath the spreading tree, while many a pastime circled in the shade, the young contending as the old surveyed, and many a gambol frolicked over the ground, and slates of art and feats of strength went round. In America, when a city is to be started, the first thing is to divide up the land into town lots, and then sell these lots to whoever will buy. This is a very modern scheme, but in Ireland whole villages belong to one man, and everyone in the place pays tribute. Then villages are passed down from generation to generation, and sometimes sold outright. But there is no wish to dispose of corner lots, for when a man lives in your house and you can put him out at any time, he is of course much more likely to be civil than if he owns the place. But it has happened many times that the inhabitants of Irish villages have all packed up and deserted the place, leaving no one but the village squire and that nice man, the landlord's agent. The cottages then are turned into sheep pens or hay barns. They may be pulled down, or if they are left standing, the weather looks after that, and these are common sights to the tourist. Now the landlord, who owned every rood of the village of Lissoy, lived in London. He lived well. He gambled a little, and as the cards did not run his way, he got into debt. So he wrote to his agent in Lissoy to raise the rents. He did so, threatened, applied the screws, and the inhabitants packed up and let the landlord have his village all to himself. Let Goldsmith tell. Sweet smiling village, loveliest of the lawn, thy sports are fled, and all thy charms withdrawn. Amidst thy bowers the tyrant's hand is seen, and desolation saddens all thy green. One only master grasps the whole domain, and half a tillage stints thy smiling plain. No more thy glassy brook reflects the day, but choked with sedges works its weedy way. Along thy glades, a solitary guest, the hollow-sounding bittern guards its nest. Amidst thy desert walks the lapwing flies, and tires their echoes with unvaried cries. Sunk are thy bowers in shapeless ruin all, and the long grass overtops the mouldering wall. And trembling, shrinking from the spoiler's hand, far, far away, thy children leave the land. A titled gentleman by the name of Napier was the owner of the estate at that time, and, as his tenantry had left, he in wrath pulled down their rows of pretty white cottages, demolished the schoolhouse, blew up the mill, and took all the material and built a splendid mansion on the hillside. Cards had evidently turned in his direction, but anyway, he owned several other villages, so although he toiled not neither did he spin, yet he was well clothed and always fed. But my Lord Napier was not immortal, for he died, and was buried, and over his grave they erected a monument, and on it are these words: "He was the friend of the oppressed." The records of literature, so far as I know, show no such moving force in a simple poem as the rebirth of the village of Auburn. No man can live in a village and illuminate it by his genius. His fellow townsmen and neighbors are not to be influenced by his eloquence except in a very limited way. His presence creates an opposition, for the personal touch repels as well as attracts. Dying, 7 cities may contend for the honor of his birthplace, or after his departure, knowledge of his fame may travel back across the scenes that he has known, and move to better things. The years went by and the Napier estate got into a bad way and was sold. Captain Hogan became the owner of the site of the village of Lissoy. Now Captain Hogan was a poet in feeling, and he set about to replace the village that Goldsmith had loved and immortalized. He adopted the name that Goldsmith supplied, and Auburn it is, even unto this day. End of Oliver Goldsmith, Part 1. Recording by Luke Sartor, Brisbane, Queensland. Section 27 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Luke Sartor. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1 by Albert Hubbard. Oliver Goldsmith, Part 2. In the village green is the original spreading hawthorn tree, all enclosed in a stone wall to preserve it, and on the wall is a sign requesting you not to break off branches. Around the trees are seats. I sat there one evening with talking age and whispering lovers. The mirth that night was of a quiet sort, and I listened to an old man who recited all the desert village to the little group that was present. It cost me 6 pence, but was cheap for the money, for the brogue was very choice. I was the only stranger present, and quickly guessed that the entertainment was for my sole benefit, as I saw that I was being furtively watched to see how I took my medicine. A young fellow sitting near me offered a little Goldsmith information. Then a woman on the other side did the same, and the old man who had recited suggested that we go over and see the alehouse, where the justly celebrated Dr. Goldsmith so often played his harp so feelingly. So we adjourned to the 3 Jolly Pigeons, a dozen of us, including the lovers, whom I personally invited. And did Oliver Goldsmith really play his harp in this very room? I asked. Ay, indeed he did, your honour, and if ye don't believe it, ye can sit in the same chair that was his. So they led me to the big chair that stood on a little raised platform, and I sat in the great oaken seat, which was surely made before Goldsmith was born. Then we all took ale, at my expense. The lovers sat in one corner, drinking from one glass, and very particular to drink from the same side, and giggling to themselves. The old man wanted to again recite The Deserted Village, but was forcibly restrained, and instead, by invitation of himself, the landlord sang a song composed by Goldsmith, but which I have failed to find in Goldsmith's works, entitled When Ireland is Free. There were 13 stanzas in this song, and a chorus and refrain, in which the words of the title are repeated. After each stanza, we all came in strong on the chorus, keeping time by tapping our glasses on the tables. Then we all drank perdition to English landlords, had our glasses refilled, and I was called on for a speech. I responded in a few words that were loudly cheered, and the very good health of the American nobleman was drunk with much fervor. The Three Jolly Pigeons is arranged exactly to the letter. The whitewashed walls, the nicely sanded floor, the varnished clock that clicked behind the door, the chest contrived a doubly debt to pay, a bed by night, a chest of drawers by day, the pictures placed for ornament and use, the 12 good rules, the royal game of goose. And behold, there on the wall behind the big oak chair are the 12 good rules. The next morning I saw the modern mansion of the village preacher, whose house was known to all the vagrant train, then the little stone church, and beyond I came to the blossoming firs, unprofitable gay, where the village master taught his little school. A bright young woman teaches there now, and it is certain that she can write and cipher too, for I saw sums on the blackboard, and I also saw where she had written some very pretty mottos on the wall with colored chalk, a thing I am sure that Paddy Byrne never thought to do. Below the schoolhouse is a pretty little stream that dances over pebbles and untiringly turns the wheel in the old mill, and not far away I saw the round top of Knockrue Hill, where Goldsmith said he would rather sit with a book in hand than mingle with the throng at the court of royalty. Goldsmith's verse is all clean, sweet, and wholesome, and I do not wonder that he was everywhere a favorite with women. This was true in his very babyhood, for he was the pet of several good old dames, one of whom taught him to count by using cards as object lessons. He proudly said that when he was 3 years of age he could pick out the 10 spot. This love of pasteboard was not exactly an advantage, for when he was 16 he went to Dublin to attend college, and carried £50 and a deck of cards in his pocket. The first day in Dublin he met a man who thought he knew more about cards than Oliver did, and the man did. In 3 days Oliver arrived back in sweet Auburn, penniless, but wonderfully glad to get home, and everybody glad to see him. "It seemed as if I'd been away a year," he said. But in a few weeks he started out with no baggage but a harp, and he played in the villages and the inns, and sometimes at the homes of the rich, and his melodies won all hearts. The author of Vanity Fair says, "You come hot and tired from the day's battle, and this sweet minstrel sings to you. Who could harm the kind vagrant harper? Whom did he ever hurt? He carries no weapon, only the harp on which he plays to you, and with which he delights great and humble, young and old, the captains in the tent, or the soldiers round the fire, or the women and children in the villages at whose porches he stops and sings his simple songs of love and beauty." When Goldsmith arrived in London in 1756, he was ragged, penniless, friendless, and forlorn. In the country he could always make his way, but the city to him was new and strange. For several days he begged a crust here and there, sleeping in the doorways at night and dreaming of the flowery wealth of gentle Lissoy, where even the poorest had enough to eat and a warm place to huddle when the sun went down. He at length found work as a clerk or porter in a chemist's shop, where he remained until he got money enough to buy a velvet coat and a ruffled shirt, and then he moved to the Bankside and hung out a surgeon's sign. The neighbors thought the little doctor funny, and the women would call to him out of the second-story window that it was a fine day, but when they were ill they sent for someone else to attend them. Goldsmith was 28, and the thought that he could make a living with his pen had never come to him. Yet he loved books, and he would loiter about bookshops, pricing first editions and talking poetry to the patrons. He chanced in this way to meet Samuel Richardson, who, because he wrote the first English romance, has earned the title of Father of Lies. In order to get a very necessary loaf of bread, Dr. Goldsmith asked Richardson to let him read proof. So Richardson gave him employment, and in correcting proof, the discovery was made that the Irish doctor could turn a sentence too. He became affected with literary eczema, and wrote a tragedy, which he read to Richardson and a few assembled friends. They voted it vile, demnition, vile. But one man thought it wasn't so bad as it might be, and this man found a market for some of the little doctor's book reviews, but the tragedy was fed to the fireplace. With the money for his book reviews, the doctor bought goose quills and ink, and inspiration in bottles. Grub Street dropped in, shabby, seedy, empty of pocket but full of hope, and little suppers were given in dingy coffee houses, where success to English letters was drunk. Then we find Goldsmith making a bold stand for reform. He hired out to write magazine articles by the day, going to work in the morning when the bell rang, an hour off at noon, and then at it again until nightfall. Mr. Griffiths, publisher of the Monthly Review, was his employer, and in order to hold his newly captured prize, the publisher boarded the pockmarked Irishman in his own house. Mrs. Griffiths looked after him closely, spurring him on when he lagged, correcting his copy, striking out such portions as showed too much genius, and inserting a word here and there in order to make a purely neutral decoction, which it seems is what magazine readers have always desired. Occasionally these articles were duly fathered by great men, as this gave them the required specific gravity. It is said that even in our day there are editors who employ convict labor in this way. But I am sure that this is not so, for we live in an age of competition, and it is just as cheap to hire the great men to supply twaddle direct as it is to employ foreign paupers to turn it out with the extra expense of elderly women to revise. After working in the Griffith Literary Mill for 5 months, Goldsmith scaled the barricade one dark night, leaving behind, pasted on the wall, a ballad not only to Mrs. Griffith's eyebrow, but to her wig as well. Soon after this, when Goldsmith was 30 years of age, his first book, Enquiry into the Present State of Polite Learning in Europe, was published. It brought him a little money and tuppence worth of fame, so he took better lodgings in Green Arbor Court, proposing to do great things. Half a century after the death of Goldsmith, Irving visited Green Arbor Court. At length we came upon Fleet Market, and traversing it, turned up a narrow street to the bottom of a long, steep flight of stone steps called Breakneck Stairs. These led to Green Arbor Court, and down them Goldsmith many a time risked his neck. When we entered the court I could not but smile to think in what out-of-the-way corners genius produces her bantlings. The court I found to be a small square surrounded by tall, miserable houses, with old garments and frippery fluttering from every window. It appeared to be a region of washerwomen, and lines were stretched about the square on which clothes were dangling to dry. Poor Goldsmith! What a time he must have had of it, with his quiet disposition and nervous habits, penned up in this den of noise and vulgarity. One can imagine Goldsmith running the whole gamut of possible jokes on Breakneck Stairs and Green Arbor Court, which, by the way, was never green, and where there was no arbour. "I've been admitted to court, gentlemen," said Goldsmith proudly, one day at the Mitre Tavern. "Ah, yes, Doctor, we know. Green Arbour Court, and any man who has climbed breakneck stairs has surely achieved," said Tom Davies. In 1760, Goldsmith moved to No. 6 Wine Office Court, where he wrote the Vicar of Wakefield. Boswell reports Dr. Johnson's account of visiting him there. "I received one morning a message from poor Goldsmith that he was in great distress, and, as it was not in his power to come to me, begging that I would come to him as soon as possible, I sent him a guinea and promised to come to him directly. I accordingly went to him as soon as I was dressed, and found that his landlady had arrested him for his rent, at which he was in a violent passion. I perceived that he had already changed my guinea, and had half a bottle of Madeira and a glass before him. I put the cork in the bottle, desired he would be calm, and began to talk to him of the means by which he might be extricated. He then told me he had a novel ready for the press, which he produced for me. I looked into it and saw its merits, told the landlady I would soon return, and having gone to a bookseller, sold it for £60. I brought Goldsmith the money, and he discharged the rent, not without rating his landlady for having used him so ill." For the play of The Good-Natured Man, Goldsmith received £500, and he immediately expended £400 in mahogany furniture, easy chairs, lace curtains, and Wilton carpets. Then he called in his friends. This was at No. 2 Brick Court, Middle Temple. Blackstone had chambers just below, and was working as hard over his commentaries as many a lawyer's clerk has done since. He complained of the abominable noise and racket of "those fellows upstairs," but was asked to come in and listen to wit while he had the chance. I believe the bailiffs eventually captured the mahogany furniture, but Goldsmith held the quarters. They are today in good repair, and the people who occupy the house are very courteous, and obligingly show the rooms to the curious. No attempt at a museum is made, but there are to be seen various articles which belonged to Goldsmith, and a collection of portraits that are interesting. When "The Traveller" was published, Goldsmith's fame was made secure. As long as he wrote plays, reviews, history, and criticism, he was working for hire. People said it was clever, brilliant, and all that, but their hearts were not won until the poet had poured out his soul to his brother in that gentlest of all sweet rhymes. I pitied the man who can read the opening lines of "The Traveller" without a misty something coming over his vision. "Wherever I roam, whatever realms I see, my heart untravelled fondly turns to thee. Still to my brother turns with ceaseless pain, and drags at each remove a lengthening chain." This is the earliest English poem which I can recall that makes use of our American Indian names. "Where wild Oswego spreads her swamps around, and Niagara stuns with thundering sound." Indeed, we came near having Goldsmith for an adopted citizen. According to his own report, he once secured passage to Boston, and after carrying his baggage aboard the ship, he went back to town to say a last hurried word of farewell to a fair lady. And when he got back to the dock, the ship had sailed away with his luggage. His earnest wish was to spend his last days in sweet Auburn. "In all my wanderings round this world of care, in all my griefs, and God has given my share, I still had hopes, my latest hours to crown, amidst those humble bowers to lay me down, to husband out life's taper at its close, and keep the flame from wasting by repose. I still had hopes, for pride attends us still, amidst the swains to show my book-learned skill, around my fire an evening group to draw, and tell of all I felt and all I saw. And as a hare, whom hounds and horns pursue, pants to the place from whence at first she flew, I still had hopes, my long vexations past, here to return, and die at home at last. But he never saw Ireland after he left it in 1754. He died in London in 1774, aged 46. On the plain little monument in Temple Church where he was buried are only these words: "Here lies Oliver Goldsmith." Hawkins once called on the Earl of Northumberland and found Goldsmith waiting in an outer room, having come in response to an invitation from the nobleman. Hawkins, having finished his business, waited until Goldsmith came out, as he had a curiosity to know why the Earl had sent for him. "Well," said Hawkins, "what did he say to you?" "His lordship told me that he had read The Traveller, and that he was pleased with it, and that inasmuch as he was soon to be Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and knowing I was an Irishman, asked what he could do for me." "And what did you tell him?" inquired the eager Hawkins. "Why, there was nothing for me to say, but that I was glad he liked my poem, and that I had a brother in Ireland, a clergyman, who stood in need of help." "Enough!" cried Hawkins, and left him. To Hawkins himself are we indebted for the incident, and after relating it, Hawkins adds, "And thus did this idiot in the affairs of the world trifle with his fortunes." Let him who wishes preach a sermon on this story. But there you have it, a brother in Ireland who needs help. The brother in London, the brother in America, the brother in Ireland who needs help. All men were his brothers, and those who needed help were first in his mind. Dear little Dr. Goldsmith, you were not a hustler, but when I get to the spirit world, I'll surely hunt you up. End of Oliver Goldsmith, Part 2. Recording by Luke Sartor, Brisbane, Queensland.
Section 28 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aaron Shellhays. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Albert Hubbard. William Shakespeare, Part 1. It is a melancholy of mine own, compounded of many simples, extracted from many objects, and indeed the sundry contemplation of my travels, in which my often rumination wraps me in a most humorous sadness. As you like it. William Shakespeare. I have on several occasions been to the Shakespeare country, approaching it from different directions, but each time I am set down at Leamington. Perhaps this is by some act of Parliament. I really do not know. Anyway, I have ceased to kick against the pricks, and now meekly accept my fate. Leamington seems largely under subjection to that triumvirate of despots, the butler, the coachman, and the gardener. You hear the jingle of keys, the flick of the whip, and the rattle of the lawn-mower, and a cold, secret fear takes possession of you, a sort of half-frenzied impulse to flee before smug modernity takes you captive and whisks you off to play tiddledywinks or to dance the racket. But the tram is at the door. The outside fare is a penny, inside it's 2, and we are soon safe, for we have reached the point where the Lem and the Avon meet. Warwick is worth our while, for here we see scenes such as Shakespeare saw, and our delight is in the things that his eyes beheld. At the foot of Mill Street are the ruins of the old Gothic bridge that leads off to Banbury. Oft I have ridden to Banbury Cross on my mother's foot, and when I saw that sign and pointing finger I felt like leaving all and flying thence. Just beyond the bridge, settled snugly in a forest of waving branches, we see storied old Warwick Castle, with Caesar's Tower lifting itself from the massive green. All about are quaint old houses and shops, with red-tiled roofs and little windows with diamond panes, hung on hinges, where maidens fair have looked down on brave men in coats of mail. These narrow, stony streets have rung with the clang and echo of hurrying hoofs, the tramp of royalist and parliamentarian, horse and foot, drum and banner, the stir of princely visits, of mail-coach, market, assize, and kingly court, Colbrand, armed with giant club, Sir Guy, Richard Neville, kingmaker, and his barbaric train, all trod these streets, watered their horses in this river, camped on yonder bank, or huddled in this castle yard. And again they came back when Will Shakespeare, a youth from Stratford 8 miles away, came here and waved his magic wand. Warwick Castle is probably in better condition now than it was in the 16th century, but practically it is the same. It is the only castle in England where the portcullis is lowered at 10 o'clock every night and raised in the morning, if the coast happens to be clear, to tap of drum. It costs a shilling to visit the castle. A fine old soldier in spotless uniform, with waxed white moustache and dangling sword, conducts the visitors. He imparts full 2 shillings worth of facts as we go, all with a fierce roll of R's, as becomes a man of war. The long line of battlements, the massive buttresses, the angular entrance cut through solid rock, crooked, abrupt, with places where fighting men can lie in ambush, all is as Shakespeare knew it. There are the cedars of Lebanon, brought by crusaders from the east, and the screaming peacocks in the paved courtway, and in the great hall are to be seen the sword and accoutrements of the fabled Guy, the mace of the kingmaker, the helmet of Cromwell, and the armor of Lord Brooke, killed at Lichfield. And that Shakespeare saw these things there is no doubt, but he saw them as a countryman who came on certain fete days and stared with open mouth. We know this because he has covered all with the glamour of his rich, boyish imagination that failed to perceive the cruel mockery of such selfish pageantry. Had his view been from the inside, he would not have made his kings noble nor his princes generous, for the stress of strife would have stilled his laughter, and from his brain the dazzling pictures would have fled. Yet his fancies serve us better than the facts. Shakespeare shows us many castles, but they are always different views of Warwick and Kenilworth. When he pictures Macbeth's castle he has Warwick in his inward eye. This castle hath a pleasant seat. The air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses. This guest of summer, the temple-haunting martlet, does approve by his loved mansionry that the heaven's breath smells wooingly here. No jutty, frieze, buttress, nor coign of vantage, but this bird hath made his pendant bed and procreant cradle. Where they most breed and haunt, I have observed, the air is delicate. 5 miles from Warwick, 10 if you believe the cab-drivers, are the ruins of Kenilworth Castle. In 1575, when Shakespeare was 11 years of age, Queen Elizabeth came to Kenilworth. Whether her ticket was by way of Leamington I do not know. But she remained from July 9th to July 27th, and there were great doings most every day, to which the yeomanry were oft invited. John Shakespeare was a worthy citizen of Warwickshire, and it is very probable that he received an invitation, and that he drove over with Mary Arden, his wife, sitting on the front seat holding the baby, and all the other 7 children sitting on the straw behind. And we may be sure that the eldest boy in that brood never forgot the day. In fact, in Midsummer Night's Dream he has called on his memory for certain features of the show. Elizabeth was 41 years old then, but apparently very attractive and glib of tongue. No doubt Kenilworth was stupendous in its magnificence, and it will pay you to take down from its shelf Sir Walter's novel and read about it. But today it is all a crumbling heap. Ivy, rooks, and daws hold the place in fee, each pushing hard for sole possession. It is 8 miles from Warwick to Stratford by the direct road, but 10 by the river. I have walked both routes, and consider the latter the shorter. 2 miles down the river is Barford, and a mile further is Wasperton, with its quaint old stone church. It is a good place to rest, for nothing is so soothing as a cool church where the dim light streams through colored windows, and out of sight somewhere an organ softly plays. Soon after leaving the church, a rustic swain hailed me and asked for a match. The pipe and the Virginia weed, they mean amity the world over. If I had questions to ask, now was the time. So I asked, and Rusticus informed me that Hampton Lucy was only a mile beyond, and that Shakespeare never stole deer at all. So I hope we shall hear no more of that libelous accusation. "But did Shakespeare run away?" I demanded. "Of course he did, sir. Most all good men have run away some time." And, come to think of it, Rusticus is right. Most great men have at some time departed hastily without leaving orders where to forward their mail. Indeed, it seems necessary that a man should have run away at least once, in order afterward to attain eminence. Moses, Lot, Tarquin, Pericles, Demosthenes, St. Paul, Shakespeare, Rousseau, Voltaire, Goldsmith, Hugo, but the list is too long to give. But just suppose that Shakespeare had not run away, and to whom do we owe it that he did leave? Justice Shallow or Anne Hathaway, or both? I should say to Anne first, and his honor second. I think if Shakespeare could write an article for the Ladies' Home Journal on "Women who have helped me," and tell the whole truth, as no man ever will in print, he would put Anne Hathaway first. He signed a bond when 18 years old, agreeing to marry her. She was 26. No record is found of the marriage, but we should think of her gratefully, for no doubt it was she who started the lad off for London. That's the way I expressed it to my new-found friend, and he agreed with me, so we shook hands and parted. Charlcote is as fair as a dream of paradise. The winding Avon, full to its banks, strays lazily through rich fields and across green meadows, past the bright red brick pile of Charlcote Mansion. The river-bank is lined with rushes, and in one place I saw the prongs of antlers shaking the elders. I sent a shrill whistle and a stick that way, and out ran 4 fine deer that loped gracefully across the turf. The sight brought my poacher instincts to the surface, but I bottled them and trudged on until I came to the little church that stands at the entrance to the park. All mansions, castles, and prisons in England have chapels or churches attached, and this is well, for in the good old days it seemed wise to keep in close communication with the other world. For often, on short notice, the proud scion of royalty was compelled hastily to pack a ghostly valise and hie him hence with his battered soul, or, if he did not go himself, he compelled others to do so, and who but a brute would kill a man without benefit of the clergy? So each estate hired its priests by the year, just as men with a taste for litigation hold attorneys in constant retainer. In Charlcote Church is a memorial to Sir Thomas Lucy, and there is a glowing epitaph that quite upsets any of those taunting and defaming allusions in The Merry Wives. At the foot of the monument is a line to the effect that the inscription thereon was written by the only one in possession of the facts, Sir Thomas himself. Several epitaphs in the churchyard are worthy of space in your commonplace book, but the lines on the slab to John Gibbs and his wife struck me as having the true ring. Farewell, proud, vain, false, treacherous world. We have seen enough of thee. We value not what thou canst say of we. When the Charlcote mansion was built, there was a housewarming, and good Queen Bess, who was not so awful good, came in great state. So we see that she had various calling acquaintances in these parts. But we have no proof that she ever knew that any such person as W. Shakespeare lived. However, she came to Charlcote and dined on venison, and what a pity it is that she and Shakespeare did not meet in London afterward and talk it over. Some hasty individual has put forth a statement to the effect that poets can only be bred in a mountainous country, where they could lift up their eyes to the hills. Rock and ravine, beetling crag, singing cascade, and the heights where the lightning plays and the mists hover are certainly good timber for poetry, after you have caught your poet, but nature eludes all formula. Again, it is the human interest that adds vitality to art. They reckon ill to leave man out. End of William Shakespeare, Part 1. Section 29 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aaron Shellhays. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Albert Hubbard. William Shakespeare, Part 2. Drayton before Shakespeare's time called Warwick the heart of England, and the heart of England it is today, rich, luxuriant, slow. The great colonies of rabbits I saw at Charlcote seemed too fat to frolic, save more than to play a trick or two on the hounds that blinked in the sun. Down toward Stratford there are flat islands covered with sedge, long rows of weeping willows, low hazel, hawthorn, and places where green grow the rushes Then, if the farmer leaves a spot untilled, the dog-rose preempts the place and showers its petals on the vagrant winds. Meadow-sweet, forget-me-nots, and wild geraniums snuggle themselves below the boughs of the sturdy yews. The first glimpse we get of Stratford is the spire of Holy Trinity. Then comes the tower of the new Memorial Theater, which, by the way, is exactly like the City Hall at Dead Horse, Colorado. Stratford is just another village of Niagara Falls. The same shops, the same guides, the same hackmen, all are there save poor Low with his beadwork and sassafras. In fact, a cabby just outside of New Place offered to take me to the Whirlpool and the Canada side for $1. At least, this is what I thought he said. Of course, it is barely possible that I was daydreaming, but I think the facts are that it was he who dozed, and, waking suddenly as I passed, gave me the wrong cue. There's a Macbeth livery stable, a Falstaff bakery, and all the shops and stores keep Othello this and Hamlet that. I saw briarwood pipes with Shakespeare's face carved on the bowl, all for 1 6. Feather fans with advice to the players printed across the folds, the 7 ages on handkerchiefs, and souvenir spoons galore, all warranted Gorham's best. The visitor at the birthplace is given a cheerful little lecture on the various relics and curiosities as they are shown. The young ladies who perform this office are clever women with pleasant voices and big starched white aprons. I was at Stratford 4 days and went just 4 times to the old curiosity shop. Each day the same bright British damsel conducted me through and told her tale, but it was always with animation, and a certain sweet satisfaction in her mission and starched apron that was very charming. No man can tell the same story over and over without soon reaching a point where he betrays his weariness, and then he flavors the whole with a dash of contempt. But a good woman, heaven bless her, is ever eager to please. Each time when we came to that document certified by Judith Shakespeare, her X-mark, I was told that it was very probable that Judith could write, but that she affixed her name thus in merry jest. John Shakespeare could not write. We have no reason to suppose that Anne Hathaway could, and this little explanation about the daughter is so very good that it deserves to rank with the other pleasant subterfuge. The age of miracles is past, or that bit of jolly claptrap concerning the sacred baboons that are seen about certain temples in India. They can talk, if explain the priests, but being wise they never do. Judith married Thomas Quiney. The only letter addressed to Shakespeare that can be found is one from the happy father of Thomas, Mr. Richard Quiney, wherein he asks for a loan of £30. Whether he was accommodated we cannot say, and if he was, did he pay it back, is a question that has caused much hot debate. But it is worthy of note that, although considerable doubt as to authenticity has smooched the other Shakespearean relics, yet the fact of the poet having been struck for a loan by Richard Quiney stands out in a solemn way as the one undisputed thing in the master's career. Little did Mr. Quiney think, when he wrote that letter, that he was writing for the ages. Philanthropists have won all by giving money, but who save Quiney has reaped immortality by asking for it? The inscription over Shakespeare's grave is an offer of reward if you do, and a threat of punishment if you don't, all in choice doggerel. Why did he not learn at the feet of Sir Thomas Lucy and write his own epitaph? But I rather guess I know why his grave was not marked with his name. He was a play-actor, and the church people would have been outraged at the thought of burying a strolling player in that sacred chancel. But his son-in-law, Dr. John Hall, honored the great man, and was bound he should have a worthy resting-place. So at midnight, with the help of a few trusted friends, he dug the grave and lowered the dust of England's greatest son. Then they hastily replaced the stones, and over the grave they placed the slab that they had brought. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones." A threat from a ghost! Ah, no one dare molest that grave. Besides, they didn't know who was buried there. Neither are we quite sure. Long years after the interment, some one set a bust of the poet and a tablet on the wall over against the grave. Under certain circumstances, if occasion demands, I might muster a sublime conceit. But, considering the fact that 10,000 Americans visit Stratford every year, and all write descriptions of the place, I dare not, in the face of Baedeker, do it. Further than that, in every library there are Washington Irving, Hawthorne, and William Winter's 3 lachrymose but charming volumes. And I am glad to remember that the Columbus who discovered Stratford and gave it to the people was an American. I am proud to think that Americans have written so charmingly of Shakespeare. I am proud to know that at Stratford no man besides the master is as honored as Irving. And while I cannot restrain a blush for our English cousins, I am proud that over half the visitors at the birthplace are Americans, and prouder still am I to remember that they all write letters to the newspapers at home about Stratford-on-Avon. In England, poets are relegated to a corner. The earth and the fullness thereof belongs to the men who can kill. On this rock have the English state and church been built. As the tourist approaches the city of London for the first time, there are 4 monuments that probably will attract his attention. They lift themselves out of the fog and smoke and soot, and seem to struggle toward the blue. One of these monuments is to commemorate a calamity, the conflagration of 1666, and the others are in honor of deeds of war. The finest memorial in St. Paul's is to a certain eminent Irishman, Arthur Wellesley. The mines and quarries of earth have been called on for their richest contributions, and talent and skill have given their all to produce this enduring work of beauty, that tells posterity of the mighty acts of this mighty man. The rare richness and lavish beauty of the Wellington Mausoleum are only surpassed by a certain tomb in France. As an exploiter, the Corsican overdid the thing a bit, so the world arose and put him down. But, safely dead, his shade can boast a grave so sumptuous that Englishmen in Paris refuse to look upon it. But England need not be ashamed. Her land is spiked with glistening monuments to greatness gone, and on these monuments one often gets the epitomized life of the man whose dust lies below. On the carved marble to Lord Cornwallis I read that he defeated the Americans with great slaughter. And so, wherever in England I see a beautiful monument, I know that probably the inscription will tell how he defeated somebody. And one grows to the belief that, while woman's glory is her hair, man's glory is to defeat someone. And if he can defeat with great slaughter, His monument is twice as high as if he had only visited on his brother man a plain undoing. In truth, I am told by a friend who has a bias for statistics that all the monuments above 50 feet high in England are to the honor of men who have defeated other men with great slaughter. The only exceptions to this rule are the Albert Memorial, which is a tribute of wifely affection rather than a public testament, so therefore need not be considered here, and a monument to a worthy brewer who died and left £300,000 to charity. I mentioned this fact to my friend, but he unhorsed me by declaring that modesty forbade carving truth on monuments. Yet it was a fact that the brewer, too, had brought defeat to vast numbers, and had, like Saul, slaughtered his thousands. When I visited the site of the Globe Theatre, and found thereon a brewery, whose shares are warranted to make the owner rich beyond the dream of avarice, I was depressed. In my boyhood I had supposed that if ever I should reach this spot where Shakespeare's plays were first produced, I should see a beautiful park and a splendid monument, while some white-haired old patriarch would greet me and give a little lecture to the assembled pilgrims on the great man whose footsteps had made sacred the soil beneath our feet. But there is no park and no monument, and no white-haired old poet to give you welcome, only a brewery. "I'm on, but ain't it a big un?" protested an Englishman who heard my murmurs. Yes, I must be truthful. It is a big brewery, and there are 4 big bulldogs in the courtway, and there are big vats and big workmen in big aprons, and each of these workmen is allowed to drink 6 quarts of beer each day without charge, which proves that kindliness is not dead. Then there are big horses that draw the big wagons, and on the corner there is a big tap room where the thirsty are served with big glasses. The founder of this brewery became rich, and if my statistical friend is right, the owners of these mighty vats have defeated mankind with great slaughter. We have seen that, although Napoleon, the defeated, has a more gorgeous tomb than Wellington, who defeated him, yet there is consolation in the thought that although England has no monument to Shakespeare, he now has the freedom of Elysium, while the present address of the British worthies who have battened and fattened on poor humanity's thirst for strong drink, since Samuel Johnson was executor of Thrale's estate, is unknown. We have this on the authority of a solid Englishman, who says, "The virtues essential and peculiar to the exalted station of British worthy debar the unfortunate possessor from entering paradise. There is not a Lord Chancellor, a Lord Mayor, or Lord of the Chamber, or Master of the Hounds, or Beefeater in ordinary, or any sort of British bigwig, out of the whole of British beadledom, upon which the sun never sets in Elysium. This is the only dignity beyond their reach." The writer quoted is an honorable man, and I am sure he would not make this assertion if he did not have proof of the fact. So for the present I will allow him to go on his own recognizance, believing that he will adduce his documents at the proper time. But still, should not England have a fitting monument to Shakespeare? He is her one universal citizen. His name is honored in every school or college of earth where books are prized. There is no scholar in any clime who is not his debtor. He was born in England. He never was out of England. His ashes rest in England. But England's budget has never been ballasted with a single pound to help preserve inviolate the memory of her one son to whom the world uncovers. Victor Hugo has said something on this subject which runs about like this: "Why a monument to Shakespeare? He is his own monument, and England is its pedestal. Shakespeare has no need of a pyramid, he has his work. What can bronze or marble do for him? Malachite and alabaster are of no avail. Jasper, serpentine, basalt, porphyry, granite, stones from Paros and marble from Carrara, they are all a waste of pains. Genius can do without them. What is as indestructible as these? The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus. What monument sublimer than Lear, sterner than The Merchant of Venice, more dazzling than Romeo and Juliet, more amazing than Richard III? What moon could shed about the pile a light more mystic than that of A Midsummer Night's Dream? What capital, were it even in London, could rumble around it as tumultuously as Macbeth's perturbed soul? What framework of cedar or oak will last as long as Othello? What bronze can equal the bronze of Hamlet? No construction of lime or rock, of iron and of cement is worth the deep breath of genius, which is the respiration of God through man. What edifice can equal thought? Babel is less lofty than Isaiah. Cheops is smaller than Homer. The Colosseum is inferior to Juvenal. The Giralda of Seville is dwarfish by the side of Cervantes. St. Peter's of Rome does not reach to the ankle of Dante. What architect has the skill to build a tower so high as the name of Shakespeare? Add anything, if you can, to mind. Then why a monument to Shakespeare? I answer, not for the glory of Shakespeare, but for the honor of England. End of William Shakespeare, Part 2.
Section 30 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Elbert Hubbard. Thomas Edison, Part 1. The mind cannot conceive what man will do in the 20th century with his chained lightning. Thomas A. Edison. Some years ago, a law was passed out in Ohio, making any man ineligible to act as a magistrate who had not studied law and been duly admitted to the bar. Men who had not studied law were deemed lacking in the sense of justice. This law was designed purely for one man, Samuel M. Jones of Toledo. Was ever a Jones so honored before? In Athens of old, a law was once passed declaring that every man, either of whose parents was an alien, was not a citizen and therefore ineligible to hold office. This law was aimed at the head of one man, Themistocles. "And so you are an alien?" was the taunting remark flung at the mother of Themistocles. And the Greek matron proudly answered, "Yes, I am an alien, but my son is Themistocles." Down at Lily Dale the other day, a woman told me that she had talked with the mother of Edison, and the spirit voice had said, "It is true I was a Canadian school teacher, and this at a time when very few women taught, but I am the mother of him you call Thomas A. Edison. I studied and read and wrote, and in degree I educated myself. I had great ambition. I thirsted to know, to do, to become. But I was hampered and chained by an uncongenial atmosphere. My body struggled with its bonds, so that I grew weak, worried, sick, and died, leaving my boy to struggle his way alone. My only regret at death was the thought that I was leaving my boy. I thought that through my marriage I had killed my career, sacrificed myself. But my boy became heir to all my hunger for knowledge, and he has accomplished what I dimly dreamed. He has made plain what I only guessed. From my position here I have whispered secrets to him that only the freed spirits knew. I once thought my life was a failure, but now I know that the word failure is a term used only by foolish mortals. In the universal sense there is no such thing as failure. Just here it seems to me that someone once said that we get no mind without brain. But we had here the brain of the medium, otherwise this alleged message from the spirit realm would not be ours. So we will not now tarry to discuss psychic phenomena, but go on to other things. But the woman from Lily Dale said something just the same. Edison was born in the little village of Milan, Ohio, which lies 6 miles from Norwalk, on the road between Cleveland and Toledo. On the breaking out of the Civil War, the boy was 14 years old. His parents had moved to Sarnia, Canada, and then across to Port Huron. Young Edison used to ride up and down from Detroit on the passenger boats and sell newspapers. His standing with the Detroit Free Press, backed up by his good cheer and readiness to help the passengers with their babies and bundles, gave him free passage on all railroads and steamboat lines. There was a public library at Detroit where anyone could read, but books could not be taken away. All Edison's spare time was spent at the library, which to him was a gold mine. All his mother's books had been sold, stolen, or given away. And ahoy there, all you folks who have books! Do you not know what books are to a child hungry for truth that has no books? Of course you do not. Books to a boy like young Edison were treasure's trove, in which is stored the learning of all great and good and wise who have ever lived. And the boy has to read, and read for a decade, in order to find that books are not much after all. When Edison saw the inside of that library, and was told he could read any or all of the books, he said, "If you please, mister, I'll begin here." And he tackled the first shelf, mentally deciding that he would go through the books 10 feet at a time. A little later he bought at an auction 50 volumes of the North American Review, and moving the books up to his home at Port Huron, proceeded to read them. The war was on. Papers sold for 10 cents each, and business was good. Edison was making money, and saving it. He only plunged on books. Over at Mount Clemens, at the Springs, folks congregated, and there young Edison took weekly trips selling papers. On one such visit he rescued the little son of the station agent from in front of a moving train. In gratitude, the man took the boy to his house, and told him he must make it his home while in Mount Clemens. And then after supper the youngster went down to the station. And what was more, the station agent took him in behind the ticket window, where the telegraph instrument clicked off dots and dashes on a long strip of paper. Edison looked on with open mouth. "Would you like to become a telegraph operator?" asked the agent. "Sure," was the reply. Already the boy had read up on the subject in his library of the North American Review, and he really knew the history of the thing better than did the agent. Edison was now a newsboy on the Grand Trunk, and he arranged his route so as to spend every other night at Mount Clemens. In a few months he could handle the key about as well as the station agent. About this time the ice had carried out the telegraph line between Port Huron and Sarnia. The telegraph people were in sore straits. Edison happened along and said to the local operator, "Come out here, Bill, on this switch engine, and we'll fix things." By short snorts of the whistle for dots and long ones for dashes, they soon caught the ear of the operator on the other side. He answered back, "What t'ell is the matter with you fellows?" And Edison and the other operator roared with laughter, so that the engineer thought their think boxes needed rebabbiting. And that scheme of telegraphy with the steam whistle was Edison's first invention. Instead of going to college, Edison started a newspaper, a kind of amateur affair in which he himself wrote editorials, news items, and advertisements, this when he was 17 years old. The best way to become a skilled writer is to write, and if there is a better way to learn than by doing, the world has not yet discovered it. Also, if there is a finer advantage for a youth who would be a financier than to have a shiftless father, it has not been recorded. When 19, Edison had $2,000 in cash, more money than his father had ever seen at any one time. The Grand Trunk folks found that their ex-train boy could operate, and so they called on him to help them out up and down the line. Then the Western Union wanted extra good men, and young Edison was given double pay to go to New Orleans, where there was a pitiful dearth of operators, the Southern operators being mostly dead, and the Northern men not caring to live in the South. So Edison traveled north and south and east and west, gathering gear. He had studied the science of telegraphy closely enough to see that it could be improved upon. One message at a time for one wire was absurd. Why not 2 or 4, and why not send messages both ways at once? It was the general idea, then, that electricity traveled. Edison knew better. Electricity merely rendered the wire sensitive. Edison was getting a reputation among his associates. He had read everything, and when his key was not busy, there was in his hand a copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. He wrote a hand like a copper plate, and could take as fast as the best could send. And when it came to sending, he had made the pride of Chicago cry quits. The Western Union had need of a specially good man at Albany, where the legislature was in session, and Edison was sent there. He took the key and never looked at the clock. He cleaned up the stuff. He sat glued to his chair for 10 hours straight. At one time the line suddenly became blocked between Albany and New York. The manager was in distress, and after exhausting all known expedients went to Edison. The lanky youth called up a friend of his in Pittsburgh, and ordered that the New York give the Pittsburgh man the Albany wire. "Feel your way up the river until you find me," were the orders. Edison started feeling his way down the river. In 20 minutes he called to the manager, "The break is 2 miles below Poughkeepsie. I've ordered the section boss at Poughkeepsie to take a repairer on his hand car and go and fix it." Of course, this plain telegraph operator had no right to order out a section boss, but nevertheless he did it. He shouldered responsibility like Tom Potter of the C.B.&Q. Not long after the Albany experience, Edison was in New York, not looking for work as some say, but nosing around Wall Street investigating the Law's automatic ticker. The machine he was looking at suddenly stopped, and this blocked all the tickers on the line. An expert was sent for, but he could not start it. "I'll fix it," said a tall, awkward volunteer, the same which was Edison. History is not yet clear as to whether Edison had not originally fixed it, and Edison so far has not confessed. And there being no one else to start the machine, Edison was given a chance, and soon the tickers were going again. This gave him an introduction to the stock ticker folks, and the Western Union people he already knew. This was in 1870, and Edison was then 23 years old. He studied out how stock reporting could be bettered and invented a plan which he duly patented, and then laid his scheme before the Western Union managers. A stock company was formed, and young Edison, aged 24, was paid exactly $40,000 for his patent, and retained by the company as electrical advisor at $300 a month. In 1874, when he was 27, he had perfected his duplex telegraph apparatus, and had a factory turning out telegraph instruments and appliances at Newark, New Jersey, where 300 men were employed. In 1876, the year of the Centennial Exposition, Edison told the exposition managers that if they could wait a year or so, he would light their show with electricity. He moved to the then secluded spot of Menlo Park to devote himself to experiments, spending an even $100,000 in equipment as a starter. Results followed fast, and soon we had the incandescent lamp, trolley car, electric pen, and many other inventions. It was on the night of October the 23rd, 1879, that Edison first turned the current through an incandescent burner and got the perfect light. He sat and looked at the soft, mild, beautiful light, and laughed a joyous peal of laughter that was heard in the adjoining rooms. "We've got it, boys!" he cried, and the boys, a dozen of them, came tumbling in. Arguments started as to how long it would last. One said an hour. 24 hours, said Edison. They all vowed they would watch it without sleep until the carbon film was destroyed and the light went out. It lasted just 40 hours. Around Edison grew up a group of great workers, proud to be called Edison men, and some of these went out and made for themselves names and fortunes. Edison was born in 1847. Consequently, at this writing, he is 63 years old. He is big and looks awkward, because his dusty gray clothes do not fit, and he walks with a slight stoop. When he wants clothes, he telephones for them. His necktie is worn by the right oblique, his iron gray hair is combed by the wind. On his cherubic face usually sits a half quizzical, pleased smile, that fades into a look plaintive and very gentle. The face is that of a man who has borne burdens and known sorrow, of one who has overcome only after mighty effort. I was going to say that Edison looks like a Roman emperor, but I recall that no Roman emperor deserves to rank with him, not even Julius Caesar. The face is that of Napoleon at St. Helena, unsubdued. The predominant characteristics of the man are his faith, hope, good cheer, and courage. But at all times his humor is apt to be near the surface. Had Edison been as keen a businessman as Rockefeller, and kept his own in his own hands, he would today be as rich as Rockefeller. But Edison is worth, say $2,000,000, and that is all any man should be worth. It is all he needs. Yet there are at least 100 men in the world today, far richer than Edison, who have made their fortunes wholly and solely by appropriating his ideas. Edison has trusted people, and some of them have taken advantage of his great, big, generous, boyish spirit to do him grievous wrong. But the nearest I ever heard him come to making a complaint was when he said to me, "Fra Albertus, you never wrote but one really true thing." Well, what was that, Mr. Edison? You said, "There is one thing worse than to be deceived by men, and that is to distrust them." Now, people say I have been successful, and so I have, in degree, and it has been through trusting men. There are a few fellows who always know just what I am doing. I confide in them. I explain things to them just to straighten the matter out in my own mind. But of the men who have used Edison's money and ideas, who have made it a life business to study his patents and then use them, evading the law, not a word. From 1870 to 1890, Edison secured over 900 patents, or at the rate of one patent every 10 days. Very few indeed of these patents ever brought him any direct return, and now his plan is to invent and keep the matter a secret in his family. "The value of an idea lies in the using of it," he said to me. "You patent a thing, and the other fellow starts even with you. Keep it to yourself, and you have the machinery going before the other fellow is awake. Patents may protect some things, and still others they only advertise. Up in Buffalo you have a great lawyer who says he can drive a coach and four through any will that was ever made, and I guess he can. All good lawyers know how to break wills and contracts, and there are now specialists who secure goodly fees for busting patents. If you have an idea, go ahead and invent a way to use it, and keep your process secret." End of Thomas Edison, Part 1. Section 31 of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Elbert Hubbard. Thomas A. Edison, Part 2. The Edison factories at West Orange cover a space of about 30 acres, all fenced in with high pickets and barbed wire. Over 2,000 people are employed inside that fence. There are guards at the gates, and the would-be visitor is challenged as if he were an enemy. If you want to see any particular person, you do not go in and see him. He comes to you, and you sit in a place like the visitor's dock at Sing Sing. With me it was different. I had a note that made the gates swing wide. However, one gatekeeper scrutinized the note and scrutinized me, and then went back into a maze of buildings for advice. When he came back, the general manager was with him, and was reproving him. In a voice full of defense, the county down watchman said, "Ah, now, and how did I know but that it was a forgery? And anyhow, I'd never let in a man what looks like that, even if he had an order from Bill Taft." The Edison factories, all enclosed in the high fence and under guard, include 4 separate and distinct corporations, each with its own set of offices. Edison himself owns a controlling interest in each corporation, and the rest of the stock is owned by the managers or family. With his few trusted helpers, he is most liberal. Not only do they draw goodly salaries, but they have an interest in the profits that is no small matter. The secrets of the place are protected by having each workman stick right to one thing and work in one room. No running around is allowed. Each employee goes to a certain place and remains there all day. To be found elsewhere is a misdemeanor, and while spies at the Edison factory are not shot, they have been known to disappear into space with great velocity. To make amends for the close restrictions on workers, an extra wage is paid and the 8-hour day prevails, so help is never wanting. 99 workers out of 100 want their wages, and nothing else. Promotion, advancement, and education are things that never occur to them. But for the few that have the stuff in them, Edison is always on the lookout. His place is really a college, for to know the man is an education. He radiates good cheer, and his animation is catching. To a woman who wanted him to write a motto for her son, Edison wrote, "Never look at the clock." The argument is plain, get the thing done. And around the Edison laboratory there is no use of looking at the clock, for none of them runs. That is the classic joke of the place. Years ago Edison expressed his contempt for the man who watched the clock, and now every Christmas his office family take up a collection and buy him a clock, and present it with great ceremony. He replies in a speech on the nebular hypothesis, and all are very happy. One year the present assumed the form of an Ingersoll dollar watch, which the wizard showed to me with great pride. In the stockade is a beautiful library building, and here you see clocks galore, some of which must have cost $1,000 apiece, all silent. One clock had a neatly printed card attached, "Don't look at this clock, it has stopped," and another, "You may look at this clock, for you can't stop it." It was already stopped. One very elegant clock had a solid block of wood where the works should have been, but the face and golden hands were all complete. However, one clock was running, with a tick needlessly loud, but this clock had no hands. The Edison Library is a gigantic affair, with 2 balconies and book stacks limitless. The intent was to have a scientific library right at hand that would compass the knowledge of the world. The laboratory is quite as complete, for in it is every chemical substance known to man, all labeled, classified, and indexed. Seemingly, Edison is the most careless, indifferent, and slipshod of men, but the real fact is that such a thorough business general the world has seldom seen. If he wants, say, the Electrical Review for March, 1891, he hands the boy a slip of paper, and the book is in his hands in 5 minutes. Edison, of all men, understands that knowledge consists in having a clerk who can quickly find the thing. In his hands the card index has reached perfection. Edison has no private office, and his desk in the great library has not had a letter written on it since 1895. "I hate to disturb the mice," he said, as he pointed it out indifferently. He arrives at the stockade early, often by 7 o'clock, and makes his way direct to the laboratory, which stands in the center of the campus. All around are high factory buildings, vibrating with the suppressed roar and hum of industry. In the laboratory Edison works, secure and free from interruption unless he invites it. Much of his time is spent in the chemical building, a low, one-story structure, lighted from the top. It has a cement floor and very simple furniture, the shelves and tables being mostly of iron. "We are always prepared for fires and explosions here," said Edison, in half apology for the barrenness of the rooms. The place is a maze of retorts, kettles, tubes, siphons, and tiny brass machinery. In the midst of the mess stood 2 old-fashioned armchairs, both sacred to Edison. One he sits in, and the other is for his feet, his books, pads, and paper. Here he sits and thinks, reads, or muses, or tells stories, or shuffles about with his hands in his pockets. Edison is a man of infinite leisure. He has the faculty of throwing details upon others. At his elbow, shod in sneakers silent, is always a stenographer. Then there is a bookkeeper who does nothing but record the result of every experiment, and these experiments are going on constantly, attended to by half a dozen quiet and alert men who work like automatons. I have tried a million schemes that will not work. I know everything that is no good. I work by elimination, says Edison. When hot on the trail of an idea, he may work here for 3 days and nights without going home, and his wife is good enough and great enough to leave him absolutely to himself. In a little room in the corner of the laboratory is a little iron cot and 3 gray army blankets. He can sleep at any time, and half an hour's rest will enable him to go on. When he can't quite catch the idea, he closes up his brain cells for 10 minutes and sleeps, then up and after it again. Mrs. Edison occasionally sends meals down for the wizard when he is on the trail of a thought and does not want to take time to go home. One day the dinner arrived when Edison was just putting salt on the tail of an idea. There was no time to eat, but it occurred to the inventor that if he would just quit thinking for 10 minutes and sleep, he could awaken with enough brain power to throw the lariat successfully. So he just leaned back, put his feet in the other chair, and went to sleep. The general manager came in and saw the dinner on the table and Edison sleeping, so he just sat down and began to eat the dinner. He ate it all and tiptoed out. Edison slept 20 minutes, awoke, looked at the empty dishes, pulled down his vest, took out his regular after-dinner cigar, lighted it, and smoked away in sweet satisfaction, fully believing that he had had his dinner. And even after the general manager had come in and offered to bet him $1 he hadn't, he was still of the same mind. This spirit of sly joking fills the place, set afloat by the master himself. Edison dearly loves a joke, and will quit work any time to hear one. It is the 5 minutes' sleep and the good laugh that keep his brain from becoming a hot box. He gets his rest. "When do you take your vacation, Mr. Edison?" a lady asked him. "Election night every November," was the reply. And this is literally true, for on that night there is a special wire run into the Orange Clubhouse, and Edison takes the key and sits there until daylight taking the returns, writing them out carefully in that copperplate Western Union hand. He is as careful about his handwriting now as if he were writing out train orders. "If I wanted to live 100 years, I would use neither tobacco nor coffee," said Edison as we sat at lunch. "But you see I'd rather get a little really good work done than live long and do nothing to speak of. And so I spur what I am pleased to call my mind, at times with coffee and a good cigar. Just pass the matches, thank you. Some day some fellow will invent a way of concentrating and storing up sunshine to use instead of this old, absurd Prometheus scheme of fire. I'll do the trick myself if someone else doesn't get at it. Why, that is all there is about my work in electricity. You know I never claimed to have invented electricity. That is a campaign lie. Nail it. Sunshine is spread out thin, and so is electricity. Perhaps they are the same, but we will take that up later. Now the trick was, you see, to concentrate the juice and liberate it as you need it. The old-fashioned way inaugurated by Jove, of letting it off in a clap of thunder, is dangerous, disconcerting, and wasteful. It doesn't fetch up anywhere. My task was to divide the current and use it in a great number of little lights, and to do this I had to store it. And we haven't really found out how to store it yet and let it off real easy like and cheap. Why, we have just begun to commence to get ready to find out about electricity. This scheme of combustion to get power makes me sick to think of. It is so wasteful. It is just the old, foolish Prometheus idea, and the father of Prometheus was a baboon. When we learn how to store electricity, we will cease being apes ourselves. Until then, we are tailless orangutans. You see, we should utilize natural forces and thus get all of our power. Sunshine is a form of energy, and the winds and the tides are manifestations of energy. Do we use them? Oh, no. We burn up wood and coal, as renters burn up the front fence for fuel. We live like squatters, not as if we owned the property. There must surely come a time when heat and power will be stored in unlimited quantities in every community, all gathered by natural forces. Electricity ought to be as cheap as oxygen, for it cannot be destroyed. Now, I am not sure but that my new storage battery is the thing. I'd tell you about that, but I don't want to bore you. Of course, I know that nothing is more interesting to the public than a good lie. You see, I have been a newspaper man myself, used to run a newspaper. In fact, Veritas, an old subscriber, once took exception to one of my editorials and threw me into the Detroit River. That is where I got my little deafness. What's that? No, I did not say my deftness. I got that in another way. But about lies, you have heard that one about my smoking big black cigars. Well, the story is that the boys in the office used to steal my cigars, and so I got a cigar maker to make me up a box that looked just like my favorite brand, only I had 'em filled with hemp, horsehair, and a touch of asafoetida. Then I just left the box where the boys would be sure to dip into it. But it seems the cigar man put them on, and so they just put that box into my own private stock, and I smoked the fumigators and never knew the difference. That whole story is a pernicious malrepresentation invented by the enemy of mankind in order to throw obloquy over a virtuous old telegraph operator. Brand it. Witness, therefore, that I have branded it forevermore. Once upon a day I wrote an article on Alexander Humboldt, and in that article, among other things, I said, "This world of ours, round like an orange and slightly flattened at the poles, has produced but 5 educated men." And ironical ladies and gents from all parts of the United States wrote me on postal cards, begging that I should name the other 4. Let us leave the cynics to their little pleasantries, and make our appeal to people who think. Education means evolution, development, growth. Education is comparative, for there is no fixed standard. All men know more than some men, and some men know more than some other men. Every man I meet is my master in some particular, said Emerson. But there are 5 men in history who had minds so developed, and evolved beyond the rest of mankind so far, that they form a class by themselves, and deserve to be called educated men. The men I have in mind were the following: Pericles, builder of Athens; Aristotle, tutor of Alexander and the world's first naturalist; Leonardo, the all-round man, the man who could do more things, and do them well, than any other man who ever lived; Sir Isaac Newton, the mathematician, who analyzed light and discovered the law of gravitation; Alexander von Humboldt, explorer and naturalist, who compassed the entire scientific knowledge of the world, issued his books in deluxe limited editions at his own expense, and sold them for $3,000 a set. Newton and Humboldt each wore a 7 3/4 hat. Leonardo and Aristotle went untaped, but Pericles had a head so high and so big that he looked like a caricature, and Aristophanes, a nice man who lived at the same time, said that the head of Pericles looked like a pumpkin that had been sat upon. All the busts of Pericles represent him wearing a helmet, this to avoid what the artists thought an abnormality, the average Greek having a round, smooth chucklehead like that of a Bowery bartender. America has produced 2 men who stand out so far beyond the rest of mankind that they form a class by themselves, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas A. Edison. Franklin wore a 7 1/2 hat. Edison wears a 7 3/4. The difference in men is the difference in brain power, and while size does not always token quality, yet size and surface are necessary to get power, and there is no record of a man with a 6 1/2 head ever making a ripple in the intellectual sea. Without the cells you get no mind, and if mind exists without the cells, it has not yet been proven. The brain is a storage battery made up of millions of minute cells. The weight of an average man's brain is 49 ounces. Now Humboldt's brain weighed 56 ounces, and Newton's and Franklin's weighed 57. Let us hope the autopsist will not have a chance to weigh Edison's brain for many years, but when he does, the mark will register 57 ounces. The orangutan weighs about the same as a man, but its brain weighs only a pound, against 3 pounds for a man. Give a gorilla a brain weighing 50 ounces, and he would be a Methodist presiding elder. Give him the brain the same size of Edison's, say 57 ounces, and instead of spending life in hunting for snakes and heaving cocoanuts at monkeys as respectable gorillas are wont, he would be weighing the world in scales of his own invention and making, and measuring the distances of the stars. Pericles was taught by the gentle Anaxagoras, who gave all his money to the state in order that he might be free. The state reciprocated by cutting off his head, for republics are always ungrateful. Aristotle was a pupil of Plato, and worked his way through college, sifting ashes, washing windows, and sweeping sidewalks. Leonardo was self-taught, and gathered knowledge as a bee gathers honey, although honey isn't honey until the bee digests it. Sir Isaac Newton was a Cambridge man. He held the office of Master of the Mint, and to relieve himself of the charge of atheism, he anticipated the enemy and wrote a book on the Hebrew prophets, which gave the scientists the laugh on him, but made his position with the state secure. Newton is the only man herein mentioned who knew anything about theology, all the others being infidels in their day, devoting themselves strictly to this world. Humboldt was taught by the natural method, and never took a college degree. Franklin was a graduate of the University of Hard Knocks, and Edison's alma mater is the same. There is one special characteristic manifested by the 7 educated men I have named: good cheer, a great welling sense of happiness. They were all good animals. They gloried in life. They loved the men and women who were still on earth. They feasted on the good things in life, breathed deeply, slept soundly, and did not bother about the future. Their working motto was, "One world at a time." They were all able to laugh. Genius is a great fund of joyousness. Each and all of these men influenced the world profoundly. We are different people because they lived. Every house, school, library, and workshop in Christendom is touched by their presence. All are dead but Edison, yet their influence can never die. And no one in the list has influenced civilization so profoundly as Edison. You cannot look out of a window in any city in Europe or America without beholding the influence of his thought. You may say that the science of electricity has gone past him, but all the sons of Jove have built on him. He gave us the electric light and the electric car, and pointed the way to the telephone, 3 things that have revolutionized society. As Athens at her height was the age of Pericles, so will our time be known as the age of Edison. So here endeth Little Journeys to the Homes of Good Men and Great, being Volume 1 of the series, as written by Elbert Hubbard, edited and arranged by Fred Bann, borders and initials by Roycroft Artists, and produced by the Roycrofters, at their shops, which are in East Aurora, Erie County, New York, 1922. End of Thomas A. Edison Part 2. End of Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great, Volume 1, by Elbert Hubbard.